Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving into a story that sounds like science fiction but happened right here on Earth. Picture this. You're swimming through ancient seas 400 million years ago, and something extraordinary is about to unfold. Fish are about to do the impossible. They're about to grow legs and walk onto land for the very first time in the history of our planet. This isn't just another evolutionary tale. This is the moment that made your existence possible. Before we jump in, take a moment to like this video if you're ready for a journey through deep time, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what fascinates you most about ancient life. It's always incredible to connect with fellow time travelers from around the globe. Now settle in, maybe grab a warm drink, and let's travel back to one of the most revolutionary periods in Earth's history, the Devonian. An era when our planet transformed so dramatically that nothing would ever be the same again. 419 million years ago, Earth was an alien world. The continents were arranged in ways that would confuse any modern geographer. Massive Gondwana dominated the southern hemisphere, while smaller landmasses like Siberia floated in northern seas. Between them sat Laurasia, a medium-sized continent that would play host to some of evolution's most dramatic experiments. But here's what made the Devonian special. Much of this available land clustered near the equator, creating a greenhouse planet with warm, mild climates that stretched from pole to pole. The temperature difference between the equator and the poles was far smaller than today. Glaciers may have existed, but they were modest compared to our modern ice caps. Instead, Earth basked in a prolonged greenhouse age, where sea levels rose high enough to flood vast areas of what we now call dry land. Shallow, warm seas stretched across continents, creating perfect laboratories for evolutionary innovation. These weren't just any seas. The Devonian oceans teemed with life in ways that would make modern marine biologists weep with joy. Coral reefs exploded across the shallow waters, building structures that dwarfed even today's Great Barrier Reef. These ancient reef systems stretched from 45 degrees south of the equator all the way to 60 degrees north, creating underwater cities of unprecedented scale and complexity. But the real stars of this aquatic show were the fish. The Devonian earned its nickname as the Age of Fishes, and for good reason. Every known aquatic environment buzzed with jawed vertebrates that had discovered the power of predation. Armored giants called placoderms dominated the seas like living tanks, their bone-plated heads and razor-sharp jaws making them the apex predators of their time. Some of these placoderms grew to monstrous proportions. Dunkleosteus stretched 33 feet from nose to tail, an armored leviathan that could snap smaller fish in half, with jaws that generated pressures exceeding those of modern great white sharks. When placoderm evolution hit its stride in the early Devonian, it went absolutely wild. These armored predators conquered rivers and seas alike, experimenting with body plans that ranged from sleek hunters to bottom-dwelling giants. Yet for all their success, the placoderms were evolutionary dead ends. The future belonged to a quieter, less dramatic group of fish that were conducting their own experiments in the shallow waters and tidal zones. These were the lobe-finned fish, the sarcopterygians, and they were about to change everything. While their ray-finned cousins focused on speed and efficiency in open water, lobe-finned fish took a different approach. Their muscular, fleshy fins contained bones arranged in patterns that would become hauntingly familiar. A single bone connected to the shoulder, followed by two parallel bones, then a complex arrangement of smaller elements. Sound familiar? It should. You're looking at the basic blueprint for every arm and leg that has ever walked, crawled, or climbed on land. But these early sarcopterygians weren't thinking about terrestrial conquest. They were solving immediate problems in their aquatic world. The warm, shallow waters of Devonian lakes and coastal areas often became oxygen poor, especially when dense mats of primitive plants began to decay. Fish that could gulp air at the surface had a crucial advantage. Those muscular fins weren't just for swimming. They were perfect for maneuvering through dense vegetation, pushing through shallow water, and even supporting the body when water levels dropped. The stage was being set for one of evolution's greatest transformations. But the fish themselves had no idea they were rehearsing for terrestrial stardom. They were simply adapting to their immediate environment, solving the day-to-day challenges of life in marginal aquatic habitats, where water met land in complex, ever-changing boundaries. Meanwhile, something equally revolutionary was happening above the waterline. The Devonian witnessed what scientists call the Silurian-Devonian terrestrial revolution, a transformation of land environments that created entirely new worlds for life to explore. At the beginning of the period, terrestrial vegetation consisted of tiny plants, barely an inch tall, simple organisms without roots, seeds, leaves, or woody tissue. They clung to moist surfaces like living carpets, unable to grow tall without the structural support that later plants would evolve. But evolution rarely stands still, and by the late Devonian, the landscape had been completely transformed. Lycophytes, sphenophytes, ferns, and progymnosperms towered overhead, some reaching heights that would impress even modern foresters. Archaeopteris, one of the first tree-like plants, stretched nearly 100 feet into the sky with trunks more than 3 feet in diameter. These weren't just bigger plants. They were ecosystem engineers that were reshaping the very surface of the planet. For the first time in Earth's history, true soil began to form. Not just weathered rock and mineral particles, but rich organic-filled earth created by generations of decaying plant matter. Root systems spread through this new medium, anchoring plants while simultaneously breaking down rock and creating even more complex soil chemistry. The appearance of soil changed everything about how water moved across landscapes, how nutrients cycled through ecosystems, and how life could establish itself in terrestrial environments. This terrestrial explosion created opportunities that early arthropods were quick to exploit. Millipedes, centipedes, and arachnids diversified rapidly, establishing the first complex food webs on land. The earliest known insect, Rhyniella precursor, appeared during this time, a small flightless hexapod that would give rise to the most diverse group of animals our planet has ever known. But here's where the story gets really interesting. All this terrestrial activity was creating powerful feedback loops that would soon draw vertebrates onto land. As plants colonized the continents, they created new habitats and new food sources. Arthropods followed the plants, establishing populations of potential prey in environments that were completely predator-free from a vertebrate perspective. Picture the scene. Lush plant communities growing along shorelines and in wetlands, teeming with arthropods that had never encountered a vertebrate predator on land. Meanwhile, in the adjacent waters, lobe-finned fish were becoming increasingly sophisticated at moving through shallow, vegetation-choked environments. Some of these fish had already evolved primitive lungs to supplement their gills in oxygen-poor water. Their muscular fins were perfectly adapted for maneuvering through complex underwater landscapes. It was a recipe for evolutionary innovation. The terrestrial world was developing into a rich, complex ecosystem full of opportunities for any vertebrate bold enough to venture ashore. And in the warm, shallow waters of the late Devonian, several lineages of lobe-finned fish were unknowingly preparing for that momentous step. The transition wouldn't happen overnight. Evolution rarely works in dramatic leaps, preferring instead to tinker with existing structures and gradually modify them for new purposes. But the pieces were falling into place. Muscular fins that could support body weight, primitive lungs that could extract oxygen from air, sensory systems that could function in both aquatic and terrestrial environments, and perhaps most importantly, rich terrestrial ecosystems that could support vertebrate life, if only vertebrates could figure out how to access them. The Devonian was building toward a climax that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of life on Earth. In the marginal environments where water met land, Where tides created temporary pools and seasonal floods left fish stranded in increasingly shallow water, natural selection was about to write one of its most important chapters. Some of these experiments would fail. Many lineages of lobe-finned fish would remain fully aquatic, perfectly adapted to their watery worlds, but never making the transition to land. Others would develop terrestrial adaptations, but prove unable to compete with later, more sophisticated tetrapods. But a few, a precious few, would master the art of living between worlds. They would develop the anatomical innovations necessary to support their bodies against gravity. They would refine their air-breathing capabilities until gills became optional rather than essential. Most dramatically, they would transform their muscular fins into something entirely new. Limbs. Arms and legs capable of carrying vertebrate life onto solid ground for the first time in the 4 billion-year history of life on our planet. This transformation was about to accelerate dramatically. In the fossil-rich deposits of the late Devonian, paleontologists have discovered the actual participants in this evolutionary drama. Fish that were no longer quite fish, but not yet fully terrestrial either. Creatures caught in the act of becoming something entirely new. These transitional forms would soon reveal the step-by-step process by which fins became limbs, gills gave way to lungs, and aquatic vertebrates became the ancestors of every land-dwelling vertebrate that has ever lived, including us. The Devonian Transformation was about to reach its most dramatic phase. Fish were about to grow legs, and nothing on Earth would ever be the same. The story of this transformation begins with a single, remarkable fossil discovery that would revolutionize our understanding of vertebrate evolution. In 2004, on the windswept shores of Ellesmere Island in Canada's remote Nunavut territory, a team of paleontologists made a discovery that would capture the world's imagination and rewrite textbooks across the globe. Edward Deichler, Neil Shubin, and Farish Jenkins had spent years searching the Arctic for fossils from the late Devonian period, specifically targeting rock formations that were exactly the right age to contain transitional forms between fish and early tetrapods. They weren't looking randomly. This was strategic paleontology at its finest, guided by evolutionary theory and geological knowledge to predict where the most important fossils might be hiding. Their persistence paid off in ways they could never have imagined. Embedded in 375-million-year-old sediments, they uncovered the remains of a creature that would become one of the most famous fossils in the world. The local Inuit elders suggested a name for this ancient discovery, Tiktaalik, meaning large freshwater fish, in Inuktitut. But this was no ordinary fish. Tiktaalik rosé stretched nearly 9 feet from nose to tail, a formidable predator that prowled the shallow freshwater environments of the late Devonian. At first glance, it looked like a bizarre cross between a crocodile and a fish, with a broad, flattened skull, sharp teeth perfectly designed for catching prey, and a long, powerful body covered in scales. It had gills for breathing underwater and fins for swimming, marking it clearly as an aquatic animal. But look closer, and Tiktaalik reveals secrets that illuminate one of evolution's most dramatic transitions. This wasn't just any lobe-finned fish. This was a creature caught in the act of becoming something entirely new, a living bridge between two worlds that had never been connected before. The skull of Tiktaalik tells a story of adaptation that would have profound implications for the future of vertebrate life. Unlike typical fish, whose heads are rigidly connected to their shoulder girdles, Tiktaalik had developed something revolutionary: a neck. For the first time in vertebrate history, a fish could turn its head independently of its body, scanning its environment with a flexibility that opened up entirely new behavioral possibilities. This might seem like a minor modification, but consider the implications. A fish that can turn its head can track prey more effectively, monitor threats from multiple directions, and navigate complex environments with unprecedented precision. For an animal living in the shallow, vegetation-choked waters where Tiktaalik made its home, this flexibility would have been enormously advantageous. But the real revelation lay in Tiktaalik's fins. These weren't the simple, ray-supported fins of typical fish, nor were they the fully developed limbs of terrestrial tetrapods. They were something entirely unique, something that would redefine our understanding of how fins become limbs. The front fins of Tiktaalik contained a sophisticated arrangement of bones that would become instantly recognizable to anyone familiar with vertebrate anatomy. A single large bone, the humerus, connected the fin to the shoulder. This was followed by two parallel bones, the radius and ulna, which formed the equivalent of a forearm. Most remarkably, Tiktaalik possessed the basic elements of a wrist, complete with bones that could flex and extend in ways that no fish fin had ever managed before. These weren't just anatomical curiosities. They were functional innovations that gave Tiktaalik capabilities no fish had ever possessed. Those powerful front fins could support the animal's weight, allowing it to prop itself up in shallow water or even venture briefly onto mudflats and shorelines. The wrist joint provided the flexibility needed to navigate through dense underwater vegetation or to push against solid surfaces with unprecedented control. Imagine Tiktaalik in its natural environment. Shallow, warm lakes surrounded by primitive forests, their waters choked with decaying plant matter that depleted oxygen levels and created challenging conditions for purely aquatic life. In these marginal habitats, Tiktaalik's unique adaptations would have provided enormous advantages. When water levels dropped, it could use its powerful fins to crawl from pool to pool. When oxygen became scarce, it could raise its head above the surface and breathe air through primitive lungs that supplemented its gills. But Tiktaalik's evolutionary significance extends far beyond its individual adaptations. This remarkable creature represents a crucial node in the tree of life, a common ancestor whose descendants would eventually colonize every terrestrial environment on Earth. The bone patterns in Tiktaalik's fins are the same patterns we see in the limbs of frogs, lizards, birds, mammals, and yes, humans. Every time you bend your elbow or flex your wrist, you're using joints that first appeared in creatures like Tiktaalik swimming through Devonian waters. The discovery of Tiktaalik also revealed something unexpected about the sequence of evolutionary changes during the fish to tetrapod transition. When researchers finally uncovered the rear portion of the skeleton, including the pelvis and hind fins, they found something that challenged existing theories about early tetrapod evolution. Traditional thinking suggested that the front limbs led the way in terrestrial adaptation, with powerful forelimbs developing first to pull the body onto land, followed later by equally capable hind limbs. But Tiktaalik's pelvic anatomy told a different story. The hip region was remarkably robust, nearly identical in size to the shoulder girdle, and equipped with a prominent ball and socket joint that could support a highly mobile femur. This discovery suggested that the evolution of powerful limbs began in aquatic environments, not on land. The enhanced hind fins of Tiktaalik weren't adaptations for terrestrial locomotion. They were improvements for swimming, for maneuvering through complex underwater landscapes, for generating the thrust needed to launch the body forward when pursuing prey or escaping predators. The implications are profound. Rather than a simple progression from front-wheel drive aquatic locomotion to four-wheel drive terrestrial movement, the transition appears to have involved sophisticated aquatic animals that had already evolved many tetrapod-like characteristics while remaining fully committed to life in the water. Tiktaalik wasn't alone in this evolutionary experiment. The late Devonian world was populated by a diverse array of transitional forms, each representing different approaches to the challenge of living between water and land. Some, like Tiktaalik, remained primarily aquatic while developing increasingly sophisticated appendages. others would soon take the next step and venture onto land itself. The environments where these crucial evolutionary developments took place were unlike anything we see in the modern world. The late Devonian featured extensive networks of rivers, lakes, and coastal wetlands that created perfect conditions for evolutionary experimentation. Tidal zones, in particular, provided dynamic environments where organisms faced constantly changing conditions. As tides retreated, fish found themselves stranded in shallow pools where temperatures soared and oxygen levels plummeted. Those individuals with better air-breathing capabilities and more effective means of moving through shallow water had crucial survival advantages. Over millions of years, these selective pressures shaped entire lineages, gradually transforming aquatic fish into something capable of exploiting terrestrial resources. But the transition wasn't just about anatomy, it required fundamental changes to virtually every aspect of vertebrate biology. Sensory systems that had evolved for underwater use needed modification for aerial environments. Respiratory systems designed for extracting oxygen from water had to be supplemented or replaced by lungs capable of processing atmospheric gases. Skeletal systems built for the buoyant support of water had to be strengthened to resist the crushing force of gravity on land. Perhaps most challenging of all, early tetrapods had to develop entirely new behavioral repertoires. Swimming and walking require completely different coordination patterns, different ways of sensing and responding to the environment, different strategies for finding food and avoiding predators. The transition from fin to limb wasn't just a change in anatomy. It was a revolution in how vertebrates interacted with their world. These challenges help explain why the fish to tetrapod transition took millions of years and involved numerous intermediate stages. Evolution doesn't work by suddenly transforming fins into legs. Instead, it tinkers with existing structures, gradually modifying them through countless small changes until they become capable of entirely new functions. The fossil record of this transition reads like a detailed instruction manual for how to build a terrestrial vertebrate from aquatic components. Each new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, revealing the step-by-step process by which our distant ancestors conquered land. Soon, we'll meet some of Tiktaalik contemporaries and descendants, creatures that took the next crucial steps in this evolutionary journey. Animals that developed the first true limbs, the first weight-bearing adaptations for terrestrial locomotion, and ultimately, the first vertebrate communities to establish permanent residence on land. The Devonian Transformation was accelerating toward its climax. The stage was set for vertebrates to make their grand entrance onto the terrestrial stage, beginning a new chapter in the history of life that continues to this day. Fish had grown the precursors to legs, and the conquest of land was about to begin in earnest. But Tiktaalik wasn't the end of the story. It was barely the beginning. While this remarkable fishapod was perfecting its unique blend of aquatic and terrestrial features, other evolutionary experiments were unfolding in the warm, shallow waters of the late Devonian world. Some would push even further toward true terrestrial life, while others would reveal just how complex and diverse these early attempts at land colonization really were. In the fossil-rich deposits of Greenland and other late Devonian sites, paleontologists have uncovered a cast of characters that reads like nature's own experimental laboratory. Each species represents a different approach to the fundamental challenge of vertebrate terrestrialization, and together they paint a picture of evolutionary innovation that rivals anything in the history of life on Earth. Meet Acanthostega, a creature whose name means spine roof and whose anatomy would revolutionize our understanding of early tetrapod evolution. At about 2 feet in length, Acanthostega was considerably smaller than Tiktaalik, but what it lacked in size, it made up for in evolutionary significance. Here was an animal that had crossed a crucial threshold that Tiktaalik had only approached. Acanthostega possessed true limbs, complete with recognizable digits, making it one of the first vertebrates in Earth's history to sport what we would unambiguously call arms and legs. But here's where the story takes a fascinating twist that demonstrates just how unpredictable evolution can be. Acanthostega's limbs weren't designed for walking on land. Despite having evolved true arms and legs, this remarkable animal was thoroughly aquatic, spending its entire life in the water. Its digits were connected by extensive webbing, perfect for swimming, but utterly useless for terrestrial locomotion. It lacked the wrist flexibility that would have allowed effective weight-bearing on land, and its overall body plan remained optimized for aquatic life. This discovery shattered long-held assumptions about early tetrapod evolution. Scientists had assumed that limbs evolved specifically for terrestrial locomotion, that the appearance of arms and legs marked the transition from water to land. Acanthostega proved that assumption wrong. Limbs, it turns out, first evolved as improvements to aquatic locomotion, providing better maneuverability through complex underwater environments filled with vegetation, rocks, and other obstacles. The 8 digits on each of Acanthostega's hands tell their own evolutionary story. Modern tetrapods have settled on 5 digits as the standard pattern, but early experiments tried different approaches. Some species had 6 digits, others 7, and Acanthostega went with 8. This diversity suggests that digit number was still being worked out through evolutionary trial and error, with different lineages experimenting with different solutions to the challenge of appendage design. But if Acanthostega remained fully aquatic despite having limbs, what drove the evolution of truly terrestrial capabilities? The answer lies partly with another remarkable creature from the late Devonian fossil record. Ichthyostega, whose name means fish roof, represents yet another approach to the challenge of life between water and land. Ichthyostega was a more robust animal than Acanthostega, with a stronger skeleton and what appears to be better weight-bearing adaptations. Its pelvic girdle was more powerfully built, its ribs more supportive, and its vertebrae strengthened with better developed joints that could handle the stresses of terrestrial locomotion. While its skull retained many fish-like characteristics, its postcranial skeleton showed clear adaptations for at least occasional life on land. Yet even Ichthyostega wasn't a fully terrestrial animal. Recent research suggests it spent most of its time in the water, venturing onto land only when necessary or advantageous. This pattern of amphibious behavior may have been the norm for early tetrapods, representing a transitional lifestyle that allowed vertebrates to exploit resources from both aquatic and terrestrial environments. The coexistence of these different species reveals something remarkable about late Devonian ecosystems. Rather than a simple progression from fish to tetrapod, we see a complex community of animals experimenting with different solutions to environmental challenges. Acanthostega perfected aquatic life with limbs. Ichthyostega developed capabilities for occasional terrestrial excursions. Other species like Emeria and Britignathus explored their own unique approaches to the waterland interface. This diversity wasn't accidental. It reflected the incredible variety of environmental niches available in late Devonian aquatic terrestrial ecosystems. Shallow lakes, rivers, coastal wetlands, tidal pools, and seasonal floodplains each presented different challenges and opportunities. Natural selection was simultaneously favoring multiple solutions, creating a rich tapestry of transitional forms that illuminate the complexity of vertebrate terrestrialization. The feeding strategies of these early tetrapods provide crucial insights into why limbs evolved in the first place. Recent analysis of skull mechanics in Acanthostega reveals that despite its aquatic lifestyle, this animal was adapted for terrestrial-style feeding. Its jaw structure and muscle attachments suggest it could effectively capture prey at the water surface, or even on land, representing a crucial intermediate step in the evolution of terrestrial predation. This discovery supports a fascinating hypothesis about early tetrapod evolution. Rather than limbs evolving primarily for locomotion, they may have initially evolved to support feeding behaviors that took advantage of prey resources at the water-land interface. An animal that could raise its head above water while supporting its body weight with muscular limbs would have access to arthropod prey that purely aquatic predators couldn't reach. The implications extend far beyond feeding. By developing the ability to operate at the boundary between aquatic and terrestrial environments, early tetrapods gained access to ecological resources that no vertebrate had ever exploited. This gave them competitive advantages that would ultimately drive further terrestrial adaptations and the eventual colonization of land environments. But the story of early tetrapod evolution isn't just about individual species and their anatomical innovations. It's also about the environmental context that made their evolution possible. The late Devonian world featured environmental conditions that were perfect for evolutionary experimentation at the waterland boundary. Extensive river delta systems created complex networks of channels, floodplains, and temporary pools that provided ideal settings for amphibious lifestyles. These environments were dynamic, constantly changing as water levels rose and fell with seasonal cycles, tidal influences, and climatic variations. Animals living in these settings faced constant challenges that favored flexibility, adaptability, and the ability to exploit multiple types of resources. The plant communities of the late Devonian played a crucial role in creating these perfect evolutionary laboratories. Extensive forests of primitive trees and ferns created complex terrestrial ecosystems that supported diverse arthropod communities. These arthropods represented a vast, largely untapped food resource for any vertebrate that could figure out how to access it. Meanwhile, the decay of terrestrial plant matter in aquatic environments created oxygen-poor conditions that favored animals with air-breathing capabilities. The combination of abundant terrestrial prey and challenging aquatic conditions created powerful selective pressures that drove the evolution of increasingly sophisticated amphibious adaptations. Recent research has also highlighted the importance of marine tolerance in early tetrapod evolution. Rather than evolving exclusively in freshwater environments, many early tetrapods appear to have been capable of surviving in brackish or even marine conditions. This capability would have allowed them to disperse across wide geographic areas, explaining the surprisingly broad distribution of late Devonian tetrapod fossils across multiple continents. The ability to tolerate marine conditions also suggests that early tetrapods were more ecologically versatile than previously thought. They weren't restricted to specific freshwater habitats, but could exploit a wide range of aquatic environments, from inland lakes to coastal estuaries. This ecological flexibility would have provided numerous opportunities for evolutionary experimentation and adaptation. Tidal environments, in particular, may have played a crucial role in driving terrestrial adaptations. The regular cycle of tidal advance and retreat created predictable periods when aquatic animals found themselves stranded in shallow pools or temporarily exposed on mud flats and beaches. Animals with better air-breathing capabilities and more effective means of moving across solid surfaces would have had significant survival advantages during these challenging periods. Over millions of years, these tidal pressures could have gradually selected for increasingly terrestrial capabilities. What began as temporary adaptations for surviving tidal exposure could have evolved into permanent features that enabled more extensive terrestrial activity. This gradual process helps explain how fully aquatic fish could eventually give rise to animals capable of living entirely on land. The diversity of early tetrapod communities also reveals something important about evolutionary innovation. Rather than following a single pathway from water to land, vertebrate terrestrialization involved multiple parallel experiments, each exploring different aspects of the amphibious lifestyle. Some lineages focused on improving aquatic locomotion with limbs. Others developed better air-breathing capabilities. Still others specialized in exploiting food resources at environmental boundaries. This parallel evolution created a rich ecosystem of transitional forms, each occupying slightly different ecological niches and contributing to the overall success of early tetrapod communities. The result was an evolutionary explosion that established vertebrates as permanent residents of terrestrial environments for the first time in Earth's history. But even as these remarkable animals were pioneering vertebrate life on land, they remained vulnerable to the environmental changes that were beginning to reshape the late Devonian world. The same warm, stable conditions that had fostered their evolution were about to give way to a period of dramatic environmental upheaval that would test the resilience of these newly terrestrial communities. Mass extinction was approaching, driven by the very terrestrial revolution that had created opportunities for tetrapod evolution. The extensive forests that had provided habitat and prey for early tetrapods were also changing global climate patterns, ocean chemistry, and atmospheric composition in ways that would prove catastrophic for many forms of life. The late Devonian extinctions would eliminate many of the transitional forms that had populated the margins between water and land, clearing the stage for a new chapter in tetrapod evolution. But the fundamental breakthrough had already occurred. Vertebrates had successfully colonized terrestrial environments, establishing the foundation for all future land-dwelling vertebrate life. The fish had grown legs, and despite the challenges that lay ahead, there would be no turning back. The conquest of land was complete, and the stage was set for the incredible diversity of terrestrial vertebrates that would follow in the Carboniferous and beyond. From these humble beginnings in late Devonian swamps and tidal pools would emerge the lineages that would eventually give rise to reptiles, birds, mammals, and ultimately us. The Devonian Transformation had achieved its most dramatic milestone. The age of terrestrial vertebrates had begun, and the history of life on Earth would never be the same. The success of early tetrapods in conquering the boundary between water and land set the stage for even more dramatic evolutionary experiments. But their triumph came at a cost that few could have predicted. The very environmental changes that had created opportunities for terrestrial vertebrates was simultaneously building toward one of the most devastating mass extinctions in Earth's history. The late Devonian extinctions didn't happen overnight. Instead, they unfolded as a series of environmental crises that stretched across several million years, each wave of destruction eliminating different groups of organisms and reshaping the biological landscape in profound ways. The marine realm, which had supported the incredible diversity of Devonian reef ecosystems, bore the brunt of this catastrophe. Those magnificent coral reefs that had stretched across shallow seas from one hemisphere to the other began to collapse. The rugose and tabulate corals that had built underwater cities larger than any modern reef system started dying en masse, their calcium carbonate skeletons dissolving in increasingly acidic waters. The stromatoporoids, those peculiar calcified sponges that had helped engineer these ancient ecosystems, vanished almost entirely from the fossil record. But what was causing this environmental devastation? The answer lies in the very terrestrial revolution that had made tetrapod evolution possible. Those extensive forests of Archaeopteris and other primitive trees that had colonized the continents were having profound effects on global climate and ocean chemistry. As these plants spread across the landscape, they began altering fundamental aspects of how Earth's systems operated. Plant roots were breaking down rock at unprecedented rates, releasing nutrients into rivers and streams that eventually flowed into the oceans. This massive influx of nutrients triggered explosive algal blooms that consumed oxygen from seawater, creating vast dead zones where marine life simply couldn't survive. The decay of all this organic matter further depleted oxygen levels, while simultaneously releasing carbon dioxide that made seawater more acidic. Meanwhile, the expansion of terrestrial plant communities was removing enormous amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. While this might sound beneficial, the long-term effects were catastrophic for organisms adapted to the warm greenhouse conditions of the Middle Devonian. Global temperatures began to drop as atmospheric carbon dioxide levels declined, triggering climate changes that many species simply couldn't survive. The placoderms, those armored giants that had dominated Devonian seas for tens of millions of years, found themselves particularly vulnerable to these changing conditions. Their massive size and high metabolic requirements made them sensitive to declining oxygen levels and temperature changes. One by one, the great armored predators disappeared from the fossil record, ending one of the most successful vertebrate experiments in Earth's history. Dunkleosteus and its relatives, the apex predators that had ruled the seas with jaws capable of crushing virtually any prey, went extinct along with most other placoderm lineages. The age of fishes was drawing to a close, and the survivors would inherit a very different world from the one that had given rise to such incredible marine diversity. But while the marine realm was experiencing catastrophic losses, some groups of organisms were proving remarkably resilient to the environmental changes sweeping across the planet. The early tetrapods, those pioneering vertebrates that had learned to exploit both aquatic and terrestrial resources, possessed advantages that would serve them well during this time of environmental upheaval. Their ability to breathe air meant they weren't dependent on dissolved oxygen in water, giving them access to environments where purely aquatic animals couldn't survive. Their limbs allowed them to move between different habitats as conditions changed, seeking out the most favorable environments for survival and reproduction. Most importantly, their amphibious lifestyle had already adapted them to dealing with environmental variability and change. The late Devonian extinctions acted as a filter, eliminating species that were too specialized or too dependent on specific environmental conditions. The tetrapods, with their flexible lifestyles and diverse capabilities, were precisely the type of organisms that could survive such filtering events. They emerged from the extinction crisis as one of the few vertebrate groups positioned to exploit the ecological opportunities created by the collapse of Devonian marine ecosystems. This survival advantage would prove crucial for the next phase of tetrapod evolution. As the Devonian period drew to a close and gave way to the Carboniferous, the early amphibians found themselves inheriting a world where many of their competitors had vanished. The ecological niches left vacant by extinct marine reptiles and placoderms provided new opportunities for diversification and specialization. The environmental changes that had triggered the late Devonian extinctions also created new types of terrestrial habitats that early tetrapods could colonize. As global climate cooled and became more seasonal, extensive wetland systems developed across the continents. These swampy environments, fed by seasonal flooding and rich in decaying organic matter, provided perfect habitats for amphibians that still required water for reproduction, but could exploit terrestrial resources for food. The Carboniferous period, which followed the Devonian, would become known as the Age of Amphibians precisely because these early tetrapods diversified so successfully in the post-extinction world. Some lineages grew to enormous sizes, becoming apex predators in terrestrial ecosystems. Others remained small and specialized for life in specific microhabitats. Still others began experimenting with adaptations that would eventually lead to the evolution of fully terrestrial vertebrates that didn't require water for reproduction. But even as amphibians were diversifying and spreading across the continents, other evolutionary experiments were beginning that would ultimately overshadow their success. Some early tetrapod lineages were developing innovations that would free them entirely from dependence on aquatic environments for reproduction. They were evolving the amniotic egg, a revolutionary adaptation that would allow vertebrates to reproduce on dry land without returning to water. This innovation would give rise to the reptiles, a group that would eventually dominate terrestrial ecosystems and give rise to dinosaurs, birds, and mammals. But that's a story for another chapter in the grand narrative of vertebrate evolution. For now, the crucial breakthrough had been achieved. Vertebrates had successfully colonized land, establishing the foundation for all future terrestrial vertebrate diversity. The transformation that began in the shallow waters of the early Devonian had reached its culmination. Fish had not only grown legs, but had used those legs to establish permanent vertebrate communities on land. The conquest of terrestrial environments represented one of the most significant adaptive radiations in the history of life, opening up entirely new realms of possibility for vertebrate evolution. Looking back across the vast span of geological time, the Devonian Transformation stands out as a pivotal moment when life on Earth fundamentally changed direction. The evolution of tetrapods from lobe-finned fishes wasn't just another step in vertebrate evolution. It was the step that made all subsequent vertebrate success on land possible, including the eventual evolution of our own species hundreds of millions of years later. The anatomical innovations pioneered by Tiktaalik, Acanthostega, and their contemporaries provided the foundation for every vertebrate that has ever walked, run, climbed, or flown. The bone patterns they established in their primitive limbs became the template for all future vertebrate appendages. The air-breathing capabilities they developed became the basis for all terrestrial respiratory systems. The sensory adaptations they evolved for life at environmental boundaries became the foundation for all vertebrate sensory systems adapted to aerial environments. Perhaps most remarkably, the ecological strategies they pioneered established patterns of vertebrate behavior and ecology that persist to this day. The ability to exploit resources from multiple environments, to move between different habitats as conditions change, and to adapt to environmental variability through behavioral flexibility, all trace back to these early amphibious pioneers. The legacy of the Devonian Transformation extends far beyond vertebrate evolution. The terrestrialization of vertebrates represented the final step in establishing complex terrestrial ecosystems that included primary producers, herbivores, and predators. For the first time in Earth's history, land environments supported complete food webs that rivaled marine ecosystems in their complexity and productivity. This terrestrial complexity would continue to increase throughout the Carboniferous and beyond, eventually giving rise to the incredible diversity of terrestrial life we see today. From tropical rainforests to Arctic tundra, from desert ecosystems to mountain meadows, virtually every terrestrial environment on Earth supports vertebrate communities that trace their ancestry back to those pioneering tetrapods of the late Devonian. The environmental challenges that drove early tetrapod evolution also established important precedents for how life responds to environmental change. The late Devonian extinctions demonstrated that environmental upheaval, while devastating for many species, can also create opportunities for evolutionary innovation and adaptive radiation. The groups that survived the crisis were those with the flexibility and adaptability to exploit new ecological opportunities. This pattern would repeat throughout Earth's history, with mass extinctions serving as evolutionary filters that eliminate specialized species while favoring more adaptable generalists. The tetrapods, with their amphibious lifestyles and diverse capabilities, represented the prototype for the type of organism that could survive such challenges and emerge stronger from periods of environmental crisis. The study of Devonian tetrapod evolution has also provided crucial insights into how major evolutionary innovations arise. The transition from fins to limbs wasn't a sudden leap, but rather a gradual process involving numerous intermediate stages, each representing successful adaptations to specific environmental challenges. This pattern of gradual change, punctuated by periods of rapid innovation, has become a central principle of evolutionary biology. Modern research techniques have allowed scientists to study these ancient transformations in unprecedented detail. CT scanning of fossil specimens reveals internal bone structures that illuminate how early tetrapods moved and lived. Geochemical analysis of fossil teeth provides information about diet and metabolism. Computer modeling helps researchers understand how primitive limbs functioned and how they might have evolved into more sophisticated appendages. These technological advances continue to refine our understanding of the Devonian Transformation, revealing new details about how vertebrates conquered land and established the foundation for all subsequent terrestrial vertebrate diversity. Each new fossil discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, helping to fill in gaps in our knowledge and providing new insights into this crucial chapter in the history of life. The implications of Devonian tetrapod evolution extend beyond academic paleontology. Understanding how vertebrates successfully made the transition from aquatic to terrestrial environments provides important insights into how organisms adapt to environmental change more generally. In an era of rapid climate change and environmental disruption, the lessons learned from studying ancient adaptive radiations become increasingly relevant. The resilience and adaptability demonstrated by early tetrapods offer hope that life can successfully navigate environmental challenges, even catastrophic ones. Their success in colonizing entirely new environments demonstrates the incredible potential for evolutionary innovation when organisms are faced with new opportunities and challenges. At the same time, the late Devonian extinctions serve as a sobering reminder of how environmental change can devastate established ecosystems. The collapse of Devonian reef systems and the extinction of dominant groups like placoderms illustrate how even highly successful organisms can become vulnerable when environmental conditions change rapidly. The balance between these two themes, evolutionary opportunity and environmental vulnerability, continues to shape life on Earth today. The story of how fish grew legs during the Devonian Transformation provides both inspiration and caution as we consider how life might respond to the environmental changes currently reshaping our planet. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the Devonian Transformation lies in its reminder of life's incredible creativity and persistence. The evolution of tetrapods from lobe-finned fishes represents one of the most dramatic examples of evolutionary innovation in Earth's history, demonstrating life's remarkable ability to find new solutions to environmental challenges and to colonize previously unexploited habitats. This creativity didn't end with the first tentative steps of early tetrapods onto Devonian shorelines. It continued through the explosive diversification of carboniferous amphibians, the evolution of reptiles, and their conquest of dry land environments, the rise of dinosaurs and their domination of terrestrial ecosystems, and ultimately the evolution of mammals and birds that would inherit the Earth after the dinosaurs' extinction. Every vertebrate that has ever lived on land owes its existence to those pioneering experiments conducted in the warm, shallow waters of the Devonian period. Every time a bird takes flight, a mammal runs across open ground, or a human takes a step, we're witnessing the legacy of that ancient transformation when fish first grew legs and ventured onto solid ground. The Devonian Transformation reminds us that we are part of an incredibly ancient and ongoing story of life's expansion into new environments and new ways of being. The same evolutionary processes that enabled our distant ancestors to colonize land continue to shape life today, driving adaptation, innovation, and the endless creativity that has made Earth such a remarkably diverse and dynamic planet. From the perspective of deep time, the evolution of tetrapods represents just one chapter in the much larger story of life's expansion across our planet. But it was a crucial chapter, one that opened up entirely new possibilities for vertebrate evolution and established the foundation for the incredible diversity of land-dwelling vertebrates that have enriched our planet's ecosystems for hundreds of millions of years. As we stand today on the same solid ground that those ancient tetrapods first explored, we carry within our bodies the legacy of their pioneering journey from water to land. The bones in our arms and legs, the lungs we use to breathe air, and the complex nervous systems that coordinate our movements all trace their origins back to those remarkable creatures that first learned to live between two worlds. The story of when fish grew legs is ultimately our story too, a reminder of the deep connections that link all vertebrate life and the incredible journey that brought us from the ancient seas to the modern world we inhabit today. It's a story of transformation, adaptation, and the endless creativity of life itself, played out across the vast canvas of geological time and preserved for us in the rocky pages of Earth's fossil record. The environmental pressures that shaped early tetrapod evolution were about to intensify dramatically. As the late Devonian world continued to transform, The delicate balance between marine and terrestrial ecosystems began shifting in ways that would challenge even the most adaptable organisms. The very success of terrestrial plant communities was creating feedback loops that rippled through every aspect of Earth's climate system. Those towering Archaeopteryx forests that had colonized the continents weren't just changing the landscape. They were fundamentally altering the chemical composition of the atmosphere and oceans. Every leaf that photosynthesized was pulling carbon dioxide from the air, gradually reducing the greenhouse gases that had maintained the warm, stable climate of the Middle Devonian. This might sound like a positive development, but for organisms adapted to greenhouse conditions, it spelled disaster. The cooling climate triggered a cascade of environmental changes that reverberated through both marine and terrestrial ecosystems. Ice caps began forming at the poles for the first time in millions of years, locking up vast quantities of water and causing sea levels to drop dramatically. The shallow, warm seas that had nurtured Devonian marine diversity suddenly became deeper and colder, creating conditions that many species simply couldn't tolerate. But the most devastating changes were happening in the ocean's chemistry. The massive influx of nutrients from terrestrial weathering was feeding explosive blooms of algae and bacteria that consumed enormous quantities of dissolved oxygen. When these microorganisms died and decomposed, they created vast dead zones where complex marine life couldn't survive. The decay process also released hydrogen sulfide, turning parts of the ocean toxic to most forms of life. These anoxic events, as geologists call them, spread across the ocean basins like underwater wildfires, suffocating marine ecosystems that had thrived for millions of years. The great reef systems that had dominated Devonian seas began collapsing as corals and stromatoporoids succumbed to oxygen depletion and ocean acidification. Within a few million years, these biological marvels that had taken tens of millions of years to build were reduced to skeletal remains slowly dissolving in increasingly acidic seawater. The placoderms, those magnificent armoured predators that had ruled the seas since the early Devonian, found themselves facing challenges their evolutionary history had never prepared them to handle. Their large body size and high metabolic rates made them particularly vulnerable to declining oxygen levels. As their prey species began disappearing and their hunting grounds became uninhabitable, even the mightiest predators like Dunkleosteus couldn't adapt quickly enough to survive. The extinction of the placoderms marked the end of one of vertebrate evolution's most successful experiments. These armored giants had dominated aquatic ecosystems for over 60 million years, exploring body plans and ecological strategies that would never be repeated in vertebrate history. Their disappearance left massive gaps in marine food webs that would take millions of years to fill. Yet while the marine realm was experiencing catastrophic collapse, life in the marginal environments between water and land was proving remarkably resilient. The early tetrapods, with their amphibious lifestyles and diverse physiological capabilities, possessed exactly the traits needed to survive environmental upheaval. Their ability to breathe air meant they weren't dependent on dissolved oxygen levels in water. Their limbs allowed them to move between different habitats as conditions changed. Most importantly, their behavioral flexibility enabled them to exploit whatever resources remained available. This environmental filtering process would prove crucial for the future direction of vertebrate evolution. The species that survived the late Devonian extinctions weren't necessarily the most specialized or the most dominant during stable times. Instead, they were the most adaptable, the organisms that could adjust their lifestyles and exploit new opportunities as environmental conditions shifted. The tetrapods emerged from this crisis as one of the few vertebrate groups positioned to take advantage of the ecological vacuum left by extinct marine predators. As the Devonian period drew to a close and the Carboniferous began, these pioneering amphibians found themselves inheriting a world where many of their former competitors had vanished. leaving vast ecological niches open for colonization. The environmental changes that triggered the extinctions also created new types of habitats that favored tetrapod diversification. The cooling climate led to more seasonal weather patterns, with wet and dry periods that created extensive wetland systems across the continents. These swampy environments, rich in decaying organic matter and supporting diverse arthropod communities, provided perfect conditions for amphibian radiation. But the tetrapods weren't content to simply occupy the ecological niches left vacant by extinct species. They began experimenting with entirely new ways of living that no vertebrate had ever attempted. Some lineages grew to enormous sizes, becoming apex predators in terrestrial food webs. Others remained small, but developed specialized feeding strategies that allowed them to exploit specific types of prey. Still others began exploring the possibilities of life in drier environments, gradually reducing their dependence on aquatic habitats. These experiments in amphibian diversity would reach their peak during the Carboniferous period, often called the Age of Amphibians. The warm, humid climate and extensive coal swamps of the Carboniferous provided ideal conditions for amphibian evolution, leading to an explosive radiation that produced some of the most remarkable vertebrates ever to walk the earth. Giant amphibians like Prionosuchus reached lengths of 30 feet, rivaling modern crocodiles in size and probably occupying similar ecological roles as semi-aquatic ambush predators. Others, like Eriops, developed heavily armored skulls and powerful jaws that allowed them to tackle prey that earlier tetrapods couldn't handle. Still others, like the snake-like Ophiderpeton, abandoned limbs entirely and returned to a more aquatic lifestyle, demonstrating that evolution doesn't always move in the direction of increasing terrestrialization. But perhaps the most significant developments were happening among smaller, less conspicuous amphibians that were gradually becoming less dependent on water for survival. These lineages were developing innovations in reproduction, physiology, and behavior that would eventually lead to the evolution of fully terrestrial vertebrates. The most important of these innovations was the amniotic egg, a self-contained reproductive system that allowed vertebrates to reproduce on dry land without returning to water. The evolution of the amniotic egg represented a breakthrough comparable to the original evolution of limbs. Just as limbs had freed vertebrates from purely aquatic lifestyles, amniotic eggs would free them from the need to return to water for reproduction. This innovation would give rise to the reptiles, a group that would eventually dominate terrestrial ecosystems and spawn the evolutionary lineages that produced dinosaurs, birds, and mammals. But the path from amphibian to reptile wasn't straightforward. Like the earlier transition from fish to tetrapod, it involved numerous intermediate stages and parallel experiments. Some early amniotes remained semi-aquatic, using their new reproductive capabilities to exploit habitats that were too dry for amphibians, but still retained some aquatic characteristics. Others pushed further into terrestrial environments, developing increasingly sophisticated adaptations for life in arid conditions. The diversification of early amniotes during the late Carboniferous and early Permian periods would set the stage for the next great chapter in vertebrate evolution. But that diversification was built on the foundation established by the Devonian tetrapods, those pioneering vertebrates that first learned to exploit the boundary between aquatic and terrestrial environments. The anatomical innovations developed by Tiktaalik, Acanthostega, and their contemporaries provided the basic toolkit that all subsequent terrestrial vertebrates would use and modify. The bone patterns they established in their primitive limbs became the template for every arm, leg, wing, and flipper that would ever evolve. The air-breathing capabilities they developed became the foundation for all terrestrial respiratory systems. The sensory adaptations they evolved for life in aerial environments became the basis for all vertebrate vision, hearing, and chemical sensing on land. Even more importantly, the ecological strategies pioneered by early tetrapods establish patterns of vertebrate behavior that persist to this day. The ability to move between different habitats, to exploit resources from multiple environments, and to adapt behaviorally to changing conditions all trace back to these amphibious ancestors. Modern vertebrates, from salmon returning to spawning grounds to birds migrating between seasonal habitats, are still using variations of the ecological strategies first developed by Devonian tetrapods. The environmental challenges faced by early tetrapods also established important precedents for how vertebrates respond to climate change and environmental disruption. The late Devonian extinctions demonstrated that environmental upheaval, while devastating for many species, can create opportunities for evolutionary innovation and adaptive radiation. The vertebrate groups that survived these challenges were those with the flexibility and adaptability to exploit new ecological opportunities. This pattern has repeated throughout vertebrate evolutionary history. Mass extinctions serve as evolutionary filters, eliminating highly specialized species while favoring more adaptable generalists. The mammals that survived the asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs, the birds that radiated after the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction, and the fish that repopulated marine ecosystems after each major extinction event all demonstrate the same principles of survival and adaptation first established by Devonian tetrapods. The study of early tetrapod evolution continues to provide insights into fundamental questions about how major evolutionary transitions occur. Advanced imaging techniques allow researchers to peer inside fossil skulls and limb bones, revealing details about brain structure, muscle attachment sites, and bone development that illuminate how these ancient animals lived and moved. Geochemical analysis of fossil teeth and bones provides information about diet, metabolism, and environmental conditions that helps reconstruct the ecological context of early tetrapod evolution. Computer modeling has become increasingly sophisticated, allowing researchers to test hypotheses about how primitive limbs functioned and how they might have evolved from fins. These models can simulate the biomechanics of locomotion in early tetrapods, helping scientists understand the selective pressures that drove the evolution of increasingly terrestrial adaptations. They can also explore the energetic costs and benefits of different locomotory strategies, providing insights into why certain anatomical innovations were favored by natural selection. Molecular biology has added another dimension to our understanding of tetrapod evolution. By comparing the genes that control limb development in modern vertebrates, researchers can identify the genetic mechanisms that were modified during the fin-to-limb transition. These studies reveal that many of the genetic tools needed for limb development were already present in fish, suggesting that the evolution of limbs involved the modification of existing developmental programs rather than the invention of entirely new genetic systems. The integration of paleontology, biomechanics, developmental biology, and molecular genetics has created a remarkably detailed picture of how vertebrates made the transition from water to land. This interdisciplinary approach continues to reveal new aspects of the Devonian Transformation, helping us understand not just what happened, but how and why it happened. The implications of this research extend beyond academic paleontology. Understanding how vertebrates successfully colonized terrestrial environments provides important insights into the general principles of evolutionary innovation and adaptation. These insights are increasingly relevant as we face rapid environmental change and consider how modern species might adapt to shifting climatic conditions. The resilience demonstrated by early tetrapods during the late Devonian extinctions offers both hope and caution for the future. Their success shows that life can be remarkably adaptable and creative in the face of environmental challenges. But their story also reminds us that even highly successful groups can become vulnerable when environmental conditions change too rapidly or dramatically. The Devonian Transformation ultimately represents one of the most profound examples of life's ability to colonize new environments and exploit previously unavailable resources. The evolution of tetrapods from lobe-finned fish opened up entirely new realms of ecological possibility, establishing the foundation for the incredible diversity of terrestrial vertebrates that have enriched Earth's ecosystems for hundreds of millions of years. This legacy continues today in every vertebrate that walks, runs, climbs, or flies. The neural circuits that coordinate our movements, the bones that support our bodies against gravity, and the lungs that extract oxygen from air all trace their origins back to those pioneering experiments conducted in the warm, shallow waters of the Devonian period. We are the living descendants of that ancient transformation, carrying within our bodies the anatomical and physiological innovations that first allowed vertebrates to conquer land. The story of when fish grew legs is ultimately a story about life's endless creativity and its remarkable ability to find new solutions to environmental challenges. It reminds us that even the most fundamental aspects of how we live and move through the world were once revolutionary innovations that arose through the gradual accumulation of small changes over millions of years. Every step we take is a testament to the success of that ancient experiment in terrestrial living, a continuation of a journey that began when our distant ancestors first ventured from the safety of aquatic environments onto the uncertain ground of the emerging land. As we reach the twilight of the Devonian period, we find ourselves witnessing not just the end of an era, but the completion of one of evolution's most audacious experiments. The transformation that began with subtle modifications to fish fins had culminated in the establishment of vertebrate communities that could thrive entirely on land. But this success story came with a price that few organisms of the time could have anticipated. The environmental upheaval that marked the late Devonian wasn't just another minor climate fluctuation. It represented a fundamental shift in how Earth's systems operated, driven by the very terrestrial revolution that had enabled tetrapod evolution. Those magnificent forests of primitive trees that had colonized the continents were inadvertently triggering a cascade of changes that would reshape the entire planet. The process was insidious and relentless. Every season of plant growth removed more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, gradually cooling a world that had basked in greenhouse warmth for millions of years. The roots of terrestrial plants were breaking down bedrock at unprecedented rates, washing massive quantities of nutrients into rivers and ultimately into the oceans. This influx of phosphorus and nitrogen created perfect conditions for bacterial blooms that would consume oxygen and poison marine environments with hydrogen sulfide. The great coral reefs that had stretched across Devonian seas began their final collapse. These underwater metropolises, which had taken tens of millions of years to construct and had supported more biodiversity than any modern reef system, started dissolving in increasingly acidic waters. The rugose and tabulate corals that had been the master builders of these ancient ecosystems simply couldn't adapt quickly enough to the changing chemistry of their environment. For the placoderms, those armoured titans that had ruled the seas for over 60 million years, the end came with surprising swiftness. Dunkleosteus and its relatives, predators so powerful they could have crushed modern great whites, found their hunting grounds transformed into oxygen-depleted dead zones. Their massive size and high metabolic demands, which had been advantages during times of plenty, became fatal liabilities as resources dwindled and environmental conditions deteriorated. The extinction of the placoderms marked the end of one of vertebrate evolution's most spectacular experiments. These armoured predators had explored body plans and ecological strategies that would never be repeated. Their disappearance created enormous gaps in marine food webs, gaps that would take millions of years to fill and would never be filled in quite the same way. Yet while the marine realm was experiencing this ecological catastrophe, something remarkable was happening in the marginal environments where water met land. The early tetrapods, those amphibious pioneers who had learned to exploit both aquatic and terrestrial resources, were demonstrating exactly the kind of flexibility that environmental crises reward. Their adaptations for life at environmental boundaries suddenly became survival advantages of the highest order. When marine habitats became uninhabitable, tetrapods could retreat to freshwater environments. When oxygen levels in water plummeted, they could breathe air. When traditional aquatic prey disappeared, they could hunt on land. This flexibility, initially evolved for exploiting opportunities, now became the key to surviving catastrophe. The late Devonian extinctions acted as a massive evolutionary filter, eliminating species that were too specialized or too dependent on stable environmental conditions. The organisms that survived weren't necessarily the largest, strongest, or most dominant during peaceful times. Instead, they were the most adaptable, the creatures that could adjust their lifestyles as circumstances demanded. This filtering process would have profound implications for the future trajectory of vertebrate evolution. The tetrapods emerged from the extinction crisis as one of the few vertebrate groups positioned to take advantage of the ecological vacuum left by extinct marine predators. They had not only survived the environmental upheaval, but were uniquely equipped to exploit the new world that was emerging from the ashes of the old. As the Devonian period gave way to the Carboniferous, these survivors found themselves inheriting a transformed planet. The cooling climate had created more seasonal weather patterns, with distinct wet and dry periods that fostered the development of extensive wetland systems across the continents. These swampy environments, rich in decaying organic matter and supporting diverse communities of arthropods, provided ideal conditions for amphibian diversification. The Carboniferous period would become known as the Age of Amphibians, and for good reason. The early tetrapods didn't simply occupy the ecological niches left vacant by extinct species. They exploded into an incredible array of forms and lifestyles that demonstrated the full potential of vertebrate terrestrial adaptation. Some lineages embraced gigantism, growing to sizes that dwarfed their Devonian ancestors. Prionosuchus, a crocodile-like amphibian, reached lengths approaching 30 feet, making it one of the largest predators ever to inhabit freshwater environments. These giants patrolled rivers and swamps with the same dominance that placoderms had once exercised in marine environments, but with the crucial advantage of being able to breathe air when aquatic conditions became challenging. Other amphibians took different approaches to terrestrial success. Eriops, a heavily built predator with a skull over 2 feet long, developed bone-crushing jaws that allowed it to tackle prey no previous tetrapod could have handled. Its robust build and powerful limbs made it perfectly suited for life in the dense undergrowth of Carboniferous forests, where it could ambush unwary arthropods and smaller amphibians. Perhaps most remarkably, some amphibian lineages began experimenting with complete abandonment of their terrestrial inheritance. Ophiderpaton and related forms gave up their limbs entirely, evolving snake-like bodies perfectly adapted for aquatic life. These creatures demonstrated that evolution doesn't always move in the direction of increasing complexity or terrestrialization. Sometimes the most successful strategy involves simplification and specialization for specific environments. But the most significant evolutionary developments were occurring among smaller, less conspicuous amphibians that were gradually becoming less dependent on water for survival. These lineages were developing innovations that would eventually free vertebrates entirely from the need to return to aquatic environments for reproduction. The most important of these innovations was the amniotic egg. The evolution of amniotic eggs represented a breakthrough comparable to the original development of limbs. Just as muscular fins had freed vertebrates from purely aquatic lifestyles, self-contained reproductive systems would liberate them from the necessity of returning to water for breeding. This innovation involved the development of specialized membranes that could protect developing embryos from desiccation while providing them with all the nutrients and waste removal systems they needed for successful development on dry land. The first amniotes appeared during the late Carboniferous, though their early fossil record remains frustratingly sparse. These pioneering reptiles retained many amphibian characteristics, but possessed the crucial ability to lay their eggs in terrestrial environments. This seemingly simple innovation opened up vast new ecological opportunities that no vertebrate had ever been able to exploit. Early amniotes could colonize habitats that were too dry to support amphibian reproduction. They could establish populations in seasonal environments where water was only available for part of the year. Most importantly, they could disperse across geographical barriers that would have been insurmountable for amphibians dependent on continuous aquatic corridors for reproduction. The diversification of early reptiles during the late Carboniferous and early Permian periods established the foundation for all subsequent vertebrate success in terrestrial environments. From these humble beginnings would emerge the evolutionary lineages that produced dinosaurs, birds, mammals, and ultimately our own species. But every step of this diversification was built on the anatomical and physiological innovations first developed by Devonian tetrapods. The bone patterns established in the fins of Tiktaalik became the template for every vertebrate limb that would ever evolve. The air-breathing capabilities developed by early tetrapods became the foundation for all terrestrial respiratory systems. The sensory adaptations that allowed these ancient animals to function in aerial environments became the basis for all vertebrate vision, hearing, and chemical sensing on land. Even more fundamentally, the ecological strategies pioneered by Devonian tetrapods established behavioral and physiological patterns that persist in modern vertebrates. The ability to exploit resources from multiple environments, to move between different habitats as conditions change, and to adapt behaviorally to environmental variability, all trace back to these amphibious ancestors. Modern examples of these ancient strategies surround us. Salmon that migrate between marine and freshwater environments are using a variation of the ecological flexibility first developed by early tetrapods. Birds that move seasonally between different habitats are employing mobility strategies that trace back to amphibians, moving between aquatic and terrestrial environments. Even mammals that hibernate or estivate to survive challenging seasons are using physiological adaptations that evolved from the environmental tolerance first developed by creatures living at the boundary between water and land. The environmental challenges that shaped early tetrapod evolution also established important precedents for how vertebrates respond to climate change and ecological disruption. The late Devonian extinctions demonstrated that environmental upheaval, while devastating for highly specialized species, can create opportunities for evolutionary innovation among more adaptable organisms. This pattern has repeated throughout vertebrate evolutionary history. The mammals that inherited the Earth after the extinction of non-avian dinosaurs were small, adaptable creatures that could exploit a wide range of resources and habitats. The birds that radiated after various extinction events were those with flexible feeding strategies and broad ecological tolerances. The fish that repopulated marine ecosystems after each major crisis were generalists that could adapt to changing conditions rather than specialists locked into narrow ecological niches. Modern research continues to reveal new aspects of the Devonian Transformation. Advanced imaging techniques allow paleontologists to peer inside fossil skulls and bones, revealing details about brain structure, muscle attachment sites, and developmental processes that illuminate how these ancient animals lived and evolved. Three-dimensional reconstruction of fossil specimens provides unprecedented insights into how early tetrapods moved and what ecological roles they played in late Devonian ecosystems. Geochemical analysis of fossil teeth and bones yields information about diet, metabolism, and environmental conditions that help scientists reconstruct the ecological context of early tetrapod evolution. Isotope signatures preserved in ancient bones can reveal whether particular species were primarily aquatic or terrestrial, what types of prey they consumed, and even what seasonal patterns characterized their environments. Biomechanical modeling has become increasingly sophisticated, allowing researchers to test hypotheses about how primitive limbs functioned and how they evolved from fins. These computer simulations can explore the mechanical constraints and opportunities that shaped early tetrapod locomotion, providing insights into the selective pressures that drove increasingly terrestrial adaptations. Perhaps most excitingly, advances in developmental biology and molecular genetics have begun to illuminate the genetic mechanisms underlying major evolutionary transitions. By studying how limbs develop in modern vertebrates, researchers can identify the genetic changes that enabled the transformation of fins into limbs. These studies reveal that many of the genetic tools required for limb development were already present in fish, suggesting that the evolution of tetrapod limbs involved creative modification of existing developmental programs rather than the invention of entirely new biological mechanisms. The integration of paleontology, biomechanics, developmental biology, and molecular genetics has created an increasingly detailed and nuanced understanding of how vertebrates conquered land. This interdisciplinary approach continues to reveal new facets of the Devonian Transformation, helping scientists understand not just the anatomical changes that occurred, but the ecological context that drove them and the genetic mechanisms that made them possible. These insights extend far beyond academic paleontology. Understanding how vertebrates successfully made the transition from aquatic to terrestrial environments provides crucial information about the general principles of evolutionary adaptation and innovation. In an era of rapid climate change and environmental disruption, the lessons learned from studying ancient adaptive radiations become increasingly relevant for predicting how modern species might respond to changing conditions. The resilience and creativity demonstrated by early tetrapods during the late Devonian environmental crisis offer both inspiration and caution for contemporary conservation efforts. Their success illustrates life's remarkable capacity for innovation and adaptation when faced with environmental challenges. The evolutionary flexibility that allowed them to exploit new ecological opportunities while their competitors went extinct demonstrates the importance of maintaining genetic and ecological diversity in modern ecosystems. At the same time, the late Devonian extinctions serve as a sobering reminder of how environmental change can devastate even highly successful evolutionary lineages. The collapse of marine ecosystems that had dominated Earth's oceans for millions of years shows how rapidly established ecological relationships can unravel when environmental conditions change beyond the tolerance limits of key species. The balance between evolutionary opportunity and environmental vulnerability continues to shape life on Earth today. The story of the Devonian Transformation provides both hope and warning as we consider how contemporary ecosystems might respond to ongoing environmental changes. It reminds us that while life has demonstrated remarkable resilience and creativity throughout Earth's history, this resilience has limits, and the pace of environmental change can overwhelm even the most adaptable organisms. Yet perhaps the most profound lesson of the Devonian Transformation lies in its demonstration of life's extraordinary creativity and persistence. The evolution of tetrapods from lobe-finned fish represents one of the most dramatic examples of evolutionary innovation in Earth's history, showing how existing structures can be modified and repurposed to solve entirely new environmental challenges. This creativity didn't end with the first hesitant steps of early tetrapods onto Devonian shores. It continued through the explosive diversification of Carboniferous amphibians, the evolution of reptiles and their mastery of terrestrial environments, the rise of dinosaurs and their domination of Mesozoic ecosystems, and ultimately the evolution of birds and mammals that would inherit the post-asteroid world. Every vertebrate that has ever walked, run, climbed, or flown owes its existence to those pioneering experiments conducted in the marginal environments of the late Devonian. The neural circuits that coordinate locomotion in modern vertebrates, the skeletal systems that support bodies against gravity, and the respiratory systems that extract oxygen from air all trace their origins to innovations first developed by creatures like Tiktaalik, Acanthostega, and their contemporaries. The anatomical legacy of these ancient pioneers lives on in every vertebrate body plan. The one bone, two bones, many bones pattern established in early tetrapod limbs became the fundamental architecture for all subsequent vertebrate appendages. Whether we're looking at the wing of a bird, the flipper of a whale, or the arm of a human, we're seeing variations on the same basic theme, first established in the fins of late Devonian fish tetrapod intermediates. But the legacy of the Devonian Transformation extends beyond anatomy to encompass fundamental aspects of vertebrate ecology and behavior. The strategies for exploiting multiple environments, moving between different habitats, and adapting to environmental change that were first developed by early tetrapods continue to characterize vertebrate success in modern ecosystems. The physiological innovations that enabled early tetrapods to bridge aquatic and terrestrial environments established the foundation for all subsequent vertebrate diversity on land. The ability to regulate body temperature, maintain water balance, extract oxygen from air, and coordinate complex movements against gravity all evolved from adaptations first developed by amphibious ancestors navigating the challenges of life at environmental boundaries. Perhaps most remarkably, the sensory and neural adaptations that allowed early tetrapods to function effectively in both aquatic and terrestrial environments established the neurological foundation for all vertebrate behavior on land. The ability to process visual information in aerial environments, detect airborne chemical signals, and coordinate complex locomotory patterns all trace back to innovations first developed by creatures learning to exploit the opportunities available at the water-land interface. The Devonian Transformation thus represents far more than just another chapter in vertebrate evolutionary history. It marks the establishment of the fundamental biological and ecological principles that have governed vertebrate life on land for the past 365 million years. Every terrestrial ecosystem that has ever existed, from carboniferous coal swamps to modern tropical rainforests, has been built on the foundation established by these ancient pioneers. The story of when fish grew legs ultimately reveals the profound interconnectedness of all vertebrate life and the deep historical roots of the biological diversity we see around us today. It reminds us that even the most familiar aspects of our own anatomy and physiology were once revolutionary innovations that arose through millions of years of evolutionary experimentation and adaptation. As we walk through the world today, we carry within our bodies the living legacy of that ancient transformation. Every step we take is a continuation of the journey that began when our distant ancestors first ventured from the safety of aquatic environments onto the uncertain terrain of the emerging land. We are the inheritors of their success, the beneficiaries of their innovations, and the continuation of their story. The Devonian Transformation stands as one of evolution's greatest achievements, a testament to life's remarkable ability to find new solutions to environmental challenges and to colonize previously unexploited realms of possibility. It reminds us that the history of life on Earth is not just a chronicle of past events, but an ongoing story of creativity, adaptation, and endless experimentation that continues to unfold around us every day. In the end, the tale of when fish grew legs is our tale too, a reminder of the extraordinary journey that brought vertebrate life from ancient seas to the modern terrestrial world we inhabit. It's a story that began in the warm, shallow waters of the Devonian period and continues today in every vertebrate that calls the land home. The transformation is complete, but the adventure continues, written in the genes, bones, and behaviors of every creature that has inherited the remarkable legacy of those pioneering tetrapods who first dared to leave the water behind and explore the vast possibilities of life on land. The final chapter of the Devonian Transformation wasn't written in the shallow waters where Tiktaalik once prowled, or in the swampy margins where Acanthostega perfected its aquatic limb strokes. It was written in the chemistry of the oceans themselves, in the slow but inexorable changes that would bring an entire age to its knees, while simultaneously launching vertebrate life into its terrestrial future. By the latest Devonian, around 375 million years ago, the planet had become a place of profound contradictions. On land, Forests of towering Archaeopteryx stretched toward the sky, their root systems penetrating deeper into bedrock than any plant before them. These weren't just trees, they were geological forces breaking down rock formations that had stood unchanged for hundreds of millions of years. With every growing season, they released massive quantities of phosphorus, nitrogen, and other nutrients into the waterways that fed the oceans. The irony was devastating in its simplicity. The very success of terrestrial ecosystems was poisoning the marine environments that had given birth to vertebrate diversity. Those nutrients streaming off the continents created perfect conditions for massive algal blooms that consumed oxygen faster than it could be replenished. When the blooms died and decomposed, they released hydrogen sulfide into the water, creating toxic dead zones that spread across entire ocean basins. The great Devonian reef systems, those underwater cities that had supported more biodiversity than any modern coral formation, began their final collapse. The rugose corals that had been master architects for millions of years simply couldn't adapt to the rapidly changing chemistry of their environment. Their calcium carbonate skeletons started dissolving in increasingly acidic waters, and within a few million years, reef ecosystems that had taken 20 million years to build were reduced to rubble. For the placoderms, this environmental catastrophe spelled doom. Dunkleosteus, that 33-foot armoured titan that had ruled the seas with jaws more powerful than any modern predator, found its hunting grounds transformed into lifeless deserts. The smaller fish that formed the base of marine food webs were among the first casualties of ocean acidification and oxygen depletion. Without prey, even the mightiest predators faced starvation. The extinction of the placoderms marked the end of one of evolution's most spectacular experiments in vertebrate design. These armoured giants had dominated marine ecosystems for over 60 million years, longer than mammals have ruled terrestrial environments. Their disappearance left ecological voids that would never be filled in quite the same way again, fundamentally altering the structure of marine food webs for all time. But while the oceans were experiencing this ecological apocalypse, something extraordinary was happening in the marginal environments where early tetrapods had learned to thrive. The same environmental flexibility that had allowed these amphibious pioneers to exploit both aquatic and terrestrial resources now became their salvation during Earth's greatest crisis. When marine environments became uninhabitable, tetrapods retreated to freshwater lakes and rivers. When oxygen levels in water plummeted, they simply lifted their heads above the surface and breathed air. When traditional aquatic prey disappeared, they turned to the rich arthropod communities that were flourishing in terrestrial environments. This adaptability, initially evolved for exploiting opportunities, had become the ultimate survival strategy. The late Devonian extinctions served as a massive evolutionary filter, eliminating organisms that had become too specialized for specific environmental conditions. The survivors weren't the largest, strongest, or most dominant species of peaceful times. They were the most flexible, the creatures capable of adjusting their lifestyles as circumstances demanded. This filtering process would reshape the entire trajectory of vertebrate evolution. As the Devonian gave way to the Carboniferous, the early tetrapods found themselves in a position no vertebrate group had ever occupied. They were the inheritors of a world where their major competitors had vanished, leaving vast ecological opportunities open for exploitation. The Carboniferous period earned its nickname as the Age of Amphibians through the explosive radiation that followed. These weren't simply bigger versions of Devonian tetrapods. They were evolutionary experiments that pushed the boundaries of vertebrate terrestrial adaptation in every conceivable direction. Some embraced gigantism on a scale that dwarfed their ancestors. Prionosuchus, resembling a massive crocodile, stretched nearly 30 feet from nose to tail, patrolling Carboniferous rivers with the same dominance that Dunkleosteus had once exercised in Devonian seas. But unlike the extinct placoderms, these amphibian giants possessed the crucial advantage of air-breathing capability. making them immune to the oxygen depletion that had doomed their marine predecessors. Other lineages explored different approaches to terrestrial success. Eriops, built like a living tank with a skull over 2 feet long, developed bone-crushing jaws that could tackle prey no previous tetrapod had been able to handle. Its heavily muscled limbs and robust skeleton made it perfectly suited for life in the dense undergrowth of carboniferous forests, where it ambushed arthropods and smaller amphibians with devastating efficiency. Perhaps most remarkably, some amphibian lineages chose to abandon their hard-won terrestrial adaptations entirely. Creatures like Ophiderpeton gave up their limbs and returned to fully aquatic lifestyles, evolving serpentine bodies perfectly adapted for swimming. These animals demonstrated that evolution doesn't always progress toward greater complexity. Sometimes the most successful strategy involves simplification and specialization. Yet the most significant developments were occurring among smaller, less conspicuous amphibians that were gradually reducing their dependence on aquatic environments for survival. These lineages were developing innovations that would ultimately free vertebrates entirely from the need to return to water for reproduction. The most revolutionary of these innovations was the amniotic egg. This wasn't simply an improvement on amphibian reproduction. It was a complete reimagining of how vertebrates could bring new generations into the world. The amniotic egg was essentially a portable pond, a self-contained aquatic environment that allowed embryos to develop on dry land while still receiving all the protection and nutrients they needed. The evolution of amniotic eggs represented a breakthrough comparable to the original development of limbs. Just as muscular fins had liberated vertebrates from purely aquatic lifestyles, self-contained reproductive systems would free them from the necessity of returning to water for breeding. This innovation opened up vast new ecological territories that no vertebrate had ever been able to colonize. The first amniotes appeared during the late Carboniferous, though their early fossil record remains tantalizingly sparse. These pioneering reptiles retained many amphibian characteristics, but possessed the crucial ability to reproduce in terrestrial environments. They could establish populations in seasonal habitats where water was only available part of the year. They could cross geographical barriers that would have been insurmountable for amphibians requiring continuous aquatic corridors. From these humble beginnings would emerge the evolutionary lineages that would dominate terrestrial environments for the next 300 million years. The basic body plan established by early reptiles would give rise to dinosaurs that ruled Mesozoic ecosystems, birds that conquered the skies, and mammals that would eventually inherit the Earth after the Great Cretaceous extinction. But every innovation in this remarkable evolutionary story was built on the foundation established by Devonian tetrapods. The bone patterns developed in Tiktaalik fins became the architectural template for every vertebrate limb that would ever evolve. The air-breathing capabilities pioneered by early amphibians became the foundation for all terrestrial respiratory systems. The sensory adaptations that allowed these ancient animals to function in aerial environments became the basis for all vertebrate perception on land. The ecological strategies developed by Devonian tetrapods established behavioral patterns that persist in modern vertebrates. The ability to exploit multiple environments, move between different habitats, and adapt to changing conditions all trace back to these amphibious ancestors. When salmon migrate between marine and freshwater environments, they're using ecological flexibility first developed by early tetrapods. When birds move seasonally between different habitats, they're employing mobility strategies that evolved from amphibians navigating between aquatic and terrestrial worlds. The environmental challenges that shaped early tetrapod evolution also established crucial precedents for how vertebrates respond to ecological disruption. The late Devonian extinctions demonstrated that environmental upheaval, while catastrophic for specialized species, creates opportunities for adaptable organisms willing to explore new ecological possibilities. This pattern has repeated throughout vertebrate evolutionary history. The mammals that inherited the post-dinosaur world were small, flexible creatures capable of exploiting diverse resources. The birds that radiated after various extinction events were those with broad ecological tolerances rather than narrow specializations. The fish that repopulated devastated marine ecosystems were generalists that could adapt to changing conditions. Modern research continues to illuminate new aspects of this ancient transformation. Advanced imaging techniques allow paleontologists to examine internal bone structures, revealing details about muscle attachments and developmental processes that explain how these animals moved and lived. Three-dimensional reconstruction provides unprecedented insights into early tetrapod locomotion and ecological roles. Geochemical analysis of fossil remains yields information about ancient diets, metabolic rates, and environmental conditions. Isotope signatures preserved in bones can reveal whether particular species were primarily aquatic or terrestrial, what types of prey they consumed, and even seasonal patterns in their ancient ecosystems. Biomechanical modeling has become increasingly sophisticated, testing hypotheses about primitive limb function and evolutionary transitions. Computer simulations explore the mechanical constraints that shaped early tetrapod locomotion, providing insights into selective pressures that drove terrestrial adaptations. Perhaps most excitingly, advances in developmental biology illuminate the genetic mechanisms underlying major evolutionary transitions. Studies of limb development in modern vertebrates reveal that many genetic tools required for tetrapod limbs were already present in fish, suggesting that fin-to-limb evolution involved creative modification of existing developmental programs rather than invention of entirely new biological systems. The integration of paleontology, biomechanics, developmental biology, and molecular genetics creates an increasingly detailed understanding of vertebrate terrestrialization. This interdisciplinary approach continues revealing new facets of the Devonian Transformation, explaining not just anatomical changes, but the ecological context that drove them, and genetic mechanisms that made them possible. These insights extend beyond academic research. Understanding how vertebrates successfully transitioned from aquatic to terrestrial environments provides crucial information about evolutionary adaptation principles. In our era of rapid environmental change, lessons from ancient adaptive radiations become increasingly relevant for predicting modern species' responses to shifting conditions. The resilience demonstrated by early tetrapods during late Devonian environmental crisis offers both inspiration and caution. Their success illustrates life's remarkable capacity for innovation when facing environmental challenges. The flexibility that allowed them to exploit new opportunities while competitors went extinct demonstrates the importance of maintaining diversity in modern ecosystems. Simultaneously, late Devonian extinctions remind us how environmental change can devastate successful evolutionary lineages. Marine ecosystem collapse shows how rapidly established ecological relationships unravel when conditions change beyond species tolerance limits. The balance between evolutionary opportunity and environmental vulnerability continues shaping life today. The Devonian Transformation provides hope and warning as we consider contemporary ecosystem responses to ongoing environmental changes. It shows that while life demonstrates remarkable resilience throughout Earth's history, this resilience has limits, and environmental change can overwhelm even adaptable organisms. Yet the most profound lesson lies in demonstrating life's extraordinary creativity and persistence. Tetrapod evolution from lobe-finned fish represents one of the most dramatic examples of evolutionary innovation in Earth's history, showing how existing structures can be modified to solve entirely new environmental challenges. This creativity continued through Carboniferous amphibian diversification, reptile evolution and terrestrial mastery, dinosaur rise and Mesozoic domination, and ultimately bird and mammal evolution in the post-asteroid world. Every vertebrate that has walked, run, climbed, or flown owes its existence to pioneering experiments conducted in late Devonian marginal environments. The anatomical legacy lives on in every vertebrate body plan. The one bone, two bones, many bones pattern established in early tetrapod limbs became fundamental architecture for all subsequent vertebrate appendages. Bird wings, whale flippers, and human arms all represent variations on the basic theme first established in late Devonian fish tetrapod intermediates. But the legacy extends beyond anatomy to encompass fundamental aspects of vertebrate ecology and behavior, strategies for exploiting multiple environments, moving between habitats, and adapting to environmental change, continue characterizing vertebrate success in modern ecosystems. The physiological innovations enabling early tetrapods to bridge aquatic and terrestrial environments established foundations for all subsequent vertebrate diversity on land. Temperature regulation, water balance maintenance, atmospheric oxygen extraction, and complex movement coordination against gravity all evolved from adaptations first developed by amphibious ancestors. The sensory and neural adaptations, allowing early tetrapods to function in both environments, established neurological foundations for all vertebrate land behavior. Visual processing in aerial environments, airborne chemical signal detection, and complex locomotory pattern coordination trace back to innovations developed by creatures learning to exploit water-land interface opportunities. The Devonian Transformation represents far more than another vertebrate evolutionary chapter. It marks the establishment of fundamental biological and ecological principles governing vertebrate land life for 365 million years. Every terrestrial ecosystem that has existed, from Carboniferous coal swamps to modern rainforests, was built on foundations established by these ancient pioneers. The story of fish growing legs reveals profound interconnectedness of all vertebrate life and deep historical roots of biological diversity surrounding us today. It reminds us that even familiar aspects of our anatomy and physiology were once revolutionary innovations arising through millions of years of evolutionary experimentation. As we move through today's world, we carry the living legacy of that ancient transformation. Every step continues the journey begun when distant ancestors first ventured from aquatic safety onto emerging land's uncertain terrain. We inherit their success, benefit from their innovations, and continue their story. The Devonian Transformation stands as one of evolution's greatest achievements, testament to life's remarkable ability to find new solutions to environmental challenges and colonize previously unexploited possibility realms. It reminds us that Earth's life history isn't just a past event chronicle, but an ongoing creativity, adaptation, and experimentation story unfolding around us daily. The tale of fish growing legs is ultimately our tale too, reminding us of the extraordinary journey bringing vertebrate life from ancient seas to the modern terrestrial world we inhabit. It's a story beginning in Devonian period, warm, shallow waters, and continuing today in every land-dwelling vertebrate. The transformation is complete, but the adventure continues, written in genes, bones, and behaviors of every creature inheriting the remarkable legacy of those pioneering tetrapods who first dared leave water behind and explore life's vast possibilities on land. The story we've been following through the Devonian reaches its crescendo, not with a single dramatic moment, but through a cascade of changes that would echo through geological time. As we stand at the threshold between the Devonian and Carboniferous periods, we're witnessing the completion of one evolutionary revolution and the beginning of another that would reshape life on Earth in ways no organism could have anticipated. The cooling climate that had begun to grip the planet was accelerating processes that would fundamentally alter both terrestrial and marine environments. Those massive ice sheets forming at the poles weren't just changing global temperatures. They were locking away enormous volumes of water, causing sea levels to drop dramatically and exposing vast areas of continental shelf that had been submerged for millions of years. This wasn't simply a matter of beaches extending a bit further inland. Entire marine ecosystems found themselves stranded above the waterline, their inhabitants forced to adapt to completely new conditions or face extinction. The shallow, warm seas that had nurtured the incredible diversity of Devonian marine life were disappearing, replaced by deeper, colder waters that many species simply couldn't tolerate. The chemical changes in seawater were equally devastating. The massive influx of nutrients from terrestrial weathering had triggered a cascade of biological processes that were consuming oxygen faster than it could be replenished. Vast stretches of ocean became anoxic dead zones where complex life simply couldn't exist. The hydrogen sulfide produced by decomposing organic matter turned parts of the sea into toxic soup that would have been lethal to most marine organisms. These weren't temporary disruptions that ecosystems could weather and recover from. They represented permanent shifts in how Earth's ocean systems operated, changes that would persist for millions of years and fundamentally alter the trajectory of marine evolution. The great age of armored predators was ending not with a whimper, but with the systematic collapse of the environments that had sustained them. Yet even as marine ecosystems were experiencing this catastrophic transformation, something extraordinary was happening in the transitional environments where our tetrapod protagonists had learned to thrive. The same environmental instability that was devastating purely aquatic species was creating new opportunities for organisms capable of exploiting both water and land resources. The dropping sea levels exposed vast areas of coastal plain that had never before supported terrestrial life. These newly available landscapes provided blank canvases for ecological experimentation, territories where the rules of survival were still being written. Early tetrapods, with their unique combination of aquatic and terrestrial capabilities, were perfectly positioned to colonize these emerging environments. The cooling climate was also creating more pronounced seasonal patterns, with distinct wet and dry periods that fostered the development of complex wetland systems across the continents. These weren't the stable, permanent water bodies that had characterized much of the Devonian. Instead, they were dynamic environments that expanded and contracted with seasonal cycles, creating exactly the type of variable conditions that favored behavioral flexibility and physiological adaptability. Imagine the landscape of the latest Devonian. Vast river deltas meandering across exposed coastal plains, their channels constantly shifting as water levels rose and fell with seasonal and climatic cycles. Temporary lakes forming in depressions during wet seasons, then shrinking to isolated pools during drier periods. Extensive marshlands where terrestrial vegetation grew right up to the water's edge, creating complex three-dimensional habitats unlike anything that had existed before. These environments were evolutionary laboratories, where natural selection was conducting experiments in vertebrate terrestrial adaptation on an unprecedented scale. Every seasonal cycle brought new challenges and opportunities. Animals that could move between shrinking pools had advantages over those trapped in single locations. Creatures that could supplement their aquatic diet with terrestrial prey could survive when fish populations crashed. Most importantly, organisms that could reproduce in temporary water bodies could colonize habitats that were inaccessible to species requiring permanent aquatic environments for breeding. The early tetrapods weren't just surviving these changing conditions, they were thriving in them. Their amphibious lifestyle initially evolved to exploit the boundary between aquatic and terrestrial environments, now provided the ultimate insurance policy against environmental uncertainty. When aquatic habitats became uninhabitable, they could retreat to terrestrial refuges. When terrestrial conditions became challenging, they could return to whatever water remained available. This flexibility was about to become even more crucial as the Devonian Transformation entered its final phase. The environmental changes that had been building gradually over millions of years were approaching a tipping point that would trigger one of the most significant biological transitions in Earth's history. The extensive forests that had colonized the continents weren't just changing the physical landscape, They were creating entirely new types of ecological relationships that had never existed before. For the first time in Earth's history, terrestrial environments supported complex food webs that included primary producers, herbivores, and predators arranged in multiple trophic levels. The arthropod communities that had followed plants onto land were diversifying into an incredible array of forms and ecological roles. Millipedes and centipedes were becoming the primary decomposers in terrestrial ecosystems, breaking down plant material and cycling nutrients through soil systems. Primitive insects were beginning to exploit the aerial realm, developing the first powered flight in animal evolutionary history. Arachnids were evolving sophisticated predatory strategies, from web-building spiders to ambush predators that could tackle prey many times their own size. This terrestrial abundance represented an enormous untapped resource for any vertebrate that could figure out how to exploit it. The arthropods living in terrestrial environments had evolved without significant vertebrate predation pressure, making them potentially vulnerable to any predator that could successfully hunt on land. The energy available in these terrestrial food webs was orders of magnitude greater than what could be sustained by the shrinking aquatic ecosystems. Early tetrapods were uniquely positioned to take advantage of these opportunities. Their limbs gave them the mobility needed to pursue terrestrial prey through complex three-dimensional habitats. Their air-breathing capabilities allowed them to remain active in environments where oxygen levels in water were too low to support purely aquatic predators. Most importantly, their behavioral flexibility enabled them to learn new hunting strategies and exploit prey types that no vertebrate had ever encountered before. But exploiting terrestrial resources effectively required more than just the ability to move on land occasionally. It demanded fundamental changes in sensory systems, locomotory capabilities, and feeding strategies that would push tetrapod evolution in entirely new directions. The early amphibians were about to undergo an adaptive radiation that would establish the foundation for all subsequent vertebrate diversity on land. The transition wasn't happening uniformly across all tetrapod lineages. Different groups were experimenting with different approaches to the challenge of terrestrial living, creating a diverse array of solutions to the same basic environmental opportunities. Some lineages focused on improving their locomotory capabilities, developing stronger limbs and more efficient gaits that allowed them to move across solid surfaces with greater speed and agility. Others concentrated on enhancing their sensory systems for aerial environments. Vision became increasingly important as a hunting sense, requiring modifications to eye structure and brain processing that could handle the different optical properties of air versus water. Hearing also became more sophisticated, with early tetrapods developing the ability to detect airborne sound waves and use acoustic information to locate prey and avoid predators. Chemical sensing underwent equally dramatic changes. The olfactory systems that had evolved for detecting waterborne molecules needed modification to process airborne chemical signals. This wasn't simply a matter of adjusting sensitivity. It required entirely new neural pathways and processing systems that could extract meaningful information from the vastly different chemical environment of the atmosphere. Perhaps most importantly, feeding strategies had to be completely reimagined for terrestrial prey. Aquatic predators rely on suction feeding and the physical properties of water to capture and manipulate prey. Terrestrial predators need entirely different approaches, using jaw mechanics and tongue manipulation that can function effectively in air rather than water. These challenges were driving rapid evolutionary changes in skull structure, jaw mechanics, and neural control systems. Early tetrapods were developing increasingly sophisticated abilities to capture, manipulate, and process terrestrial prey. Each innovation opened up new ecological opportunities and provided competitive advantages that drove further specialization and diversification. The most successful lineages were those that could balance specialization for terrestrial living with retention of aquatic capabilities. Complete abandonment of aquatic environments wasn't yet possible because reproduction still required return to water for egg laying and larval development. The most effective strategy was to become increasingly terrestrial for feeding and daily activities, while maintaining aquatic connections for reproduction. This dual lifestyle created its own evolutionary pressures and opportunities. Adults that could exploit rich terrestrial food sources could grow larger and produce more offspring than those limited to declining aquatic resources. But successful reproduction still required access to suitable aquatic environments for breeding. The most successful populations were those that could maintain territories encompassing both terrestrial feeding areas and aquatic breeding sites. These ecological requirements were shaping tetrapod behavior in increasingly sophisticated ways. Early amphibians were developing complex seasonal migration patterns, moving between terrestrial feeding areas during optimal foraging periods and aquatic breeding sites during reproductive seasons. They were also developing increasingly elaborate social behaviors related to territory defense, mate selection, and parental care. The environmental challenges of late Devonian ecosystems were also driving physiological innovations that would prove crucial for future terrestrial success. Temperature regulation became increasingly important as tetrapods spent more time in terrestrial environments where temperature fluctuations were much more extreme than in aquatic habitats. Water balance regulation also became critical, as terrestrial environments posed constant challenges of dehydration that purely aquatic animals never faced. These physiological innovations were laying the groundwork for even more dramatic evolutionary developments that would soon follow. The metabolic and regulatory systems that early tetrapods were developing to cope with terrestrial challenges would eventually enable some lineages to become completely independent of aquatic environments for survival and reproduction. But those developments were still in the future. For now, the late Devonian tetrapods were perfecting their role as amphibious intermediates, creatures that could exploit the best of both aquatic and terrestrial worlds, while avoiding the limitations that confined other vertebrates to single environments. The success of this strategy was becoming increasingly apparent as other vertebrate groups struggled with the environmental changes sweeping across the planet. The placoderms, despite their long evolutionary history and previous dominance of marine ecosystems, were proving unable to adapt to rapidly changing ocean conditions. Their highly specialized body plans and narrow ecological requirements made them vulnerable to environmental shifts that more flexible organisms could survive. The contrast between tetrapod success and placoderm failure illustrates one of evolution's most important principles. Specialization can provide tremendous advantages during stable environmental conditions, allowing organisms to become highly efficient at exploiting specific resources or habitats. But this same specialization becomes a liability when environmental conditions change rapidly, as specialized organisms often lack the flexibility needed to adapt to new circumstances. Tetrapods, with their generalized body plans and broad ecological tolerances, represented the opposite extreme. They weren't the most efficient organisms in any single environment, but their flexibility allowed them to survive and thrive when environmental conditions became unstable. This adaptability was about to become the key to inheriting the post-Devonian world. As the final million years of the Devonian period unfolded, the pace of change accelerated dramatically. The environmental transformations that had been building gradually over the Middle and Late Devonian reached a crescendo that would reshape the biological landscape in ways that persist to this day. Ocean chemistry continued to deteriorate, temperature patterns shifted toward more seasonal extremes, and sea levels dropped to expose vast areas of previously submerged continental shelf. These changes created a cascade of ecological disruptions that eliminated many of the species and ecosystems that had characterized Devonian marine environments. But they also created unprecedented opportunities for organisms capable of exploiting the new environmental conditions that were emerging from the ruins of the old Devonian world. The stage was set for one of the most significant adaptive radiations in vertebrate evolutionary history. The early tetrapods had not only survived the environmental crisis that was ending the Devonian, they had positioned themselves to become the dominant vertebrates in the new world that was emerging from the transformation. the amphibious experiments of the late Devonian were about to give rise to the first truly terrestrial vertebrate ecosystems, establishing patterns of land life that would persist for hundreds of millions of years. The fish had grown legs, learned to breathe air, and mastered the art of living between two worlds. Now they were ready to inherit the Earth itself, beginning a new chapter in the history of life that would ultimately lead to every terrestrial vertebrate that has ever lived, including ourselves. The Devonian Transformation was complete, but the story it had set in motion was just beginning. The environmental changes that had been reshaping the late Devonian world were about to reach their climax. But the story they were writing wasn't one of ending, it was one of beginning. As the final chapters of the Devonian period unfolded, the early tetrapods found themselves inheriting a planet that had been fundamentally transformed by the very processes that had enabled their evolution. The cooling climate that had triggered the collapse of marine ecosystems was simultaneously creating conditions that would prove perfect for amphibian diversification. More pronounced seasonal patterns meant that terrestrial environments experienced dramatic wet and dry cycles that created exactly the type of variable habitats where behavioral flexibility provided enormous survival advantages. During wet seasons, vast areas of low-lying terrain flooded to create temporary lakes and marshes that teemed with aquatic life. These seasonal water bodies provided ideal breeding grounds for amphibians, while supporting rich communities of arthropods and other potential prey. But as dry seasons arrived, these same areas transformed into terrestrial environments, where only organisms capable of surviving without permanent water access could persist. This cyclical transformation of habitats created a natural selection laboratory unlike anything that had existed before in Earth's history. Every seasonal transition imposed new challenges that eliminated less adaptable species, while rewarding those with greater behavioral and physiological flexibility. The early tetrapods, with their unique combination of aquatic and terrestrial capabilities, were perfectly positioned to thrive in these dynamic environments. But they weren't content to simply occupy the ecological niches that were being created by environmental change. They were actively exploring new ways of living that pushed the boundaries of what vertebrates had ever achieved. Some lineages were becoming increasingly sophisticated at terrestrial locomotion, developing more efficient gaits and stronger limb muscles that allowed them to travel greater distances across solid ground. Others were specializing in exploiting specific types of prey or habitats. Some early amphibians became ambush predators that lurked at the edges of seasonal pools, using their powerful jaws to capture unwary arthropods that came to drink. Others developed more active hunting strategies, pursuing prey through dense vegetation, using enhanced sensory capabilities and improved maneuverability. The diversity of approaches being explored by different tetrapod lineages was creating an increasingly complex web of ecological relationships. For the first time in vertebrate evolutionary history, terrestrial environments were supporting multiple species of vertebrate predators, occupying different ecological niches and employing different survival strategies. This ecological complexity was being driven by the incredible abundance of terrestrial prey that had developed during the Devonian terrestrial revolution. The arthropod communities that had colonized land environments were continuing to diversify and specialize, creating food webs of unprecedented complexity and productivity. Primitive insects were beginning to explore the three-dimensional possibilities of terrestrial environments, with some species developing rudimentary wings that allowed them to glide between plants or escape ground-dwelling predators. Spiders were perfecting web-building techniques that could capture flying insects, while centipedes and millipedes were becoming increasingly sophisticated at processing dead plant material and cycling nutrients through terrestrial ecosystems. This terrestrial abundance represented an enormous evolutionary opportunity for any vertebrate that could effectively exploit it. The energy available in these land-based food webs was orders of magnitude greater than what could be supported by the increasingly impoverished aquatic ecosystems. Early tetrapods were uniquely positioned to take advantage of these resources, but doing so required continued evolutionary innovation and adaptation. The sensory challenges of terrestrial hunting were driving rapid changes in tetrapod nervous systems and skull architecture. Vision was becoming increasingly important as a primary hunting sense, requiring modifications to eye structure and neural processing that could handle the different optical properties of air versus water. The ability to track moving prey against complex visual backgrounds demanded sophisticated visual processing capabilities that were pushing tetrapod brain evolution in entirely new directions. Hearing was also undergoing dramatic improvements. The ability to detect and localize airborne sounds provided crucial advantages for both hunting and predator avoidance in terrestrial environments. Early tetrapods were developing increasingly sensitive acoustic processing systems that could extract meaningful information from the complex soundscapes of terrestrial habitats. Chemical sensing was perhaps undergoing the most dramatic changes of all. The olfactory systems that had evolved for processing waterborne chemical signals needed complete redesign to function effectively with airborne molecules. This wasn't simply a matter of adjusting sensitivity levels. It required entirely new neural pathways and processing algorithms that could interpret the vastly different chemical information available in atmospheric environments. These sensory innovations were being integrated with increasingly sophisticated motor control systems that allowed early tetrapods to coordinate complex movements across irregular terrestrial surfaces. Walking on land required fundamentally different neural control patterns than swimming through water. Every step demanded precise coordination between multiple limbs while maintaining balance against the constant pull of gravity. The early amphibians were developing increasingly refined gaits that minimized energy expenditure while maximizing stability and speed. Some species were experimenting with alternating limb movements that provided continuous forward motion. Others were developing bounding gaits that could generate rapid acceleration for pursuing prey or escaping predators. But perhaps the most significant innovations were occurring in feeding strategies and jaw mechanics. Terrestrial prey required completely different capture and processing techniques than aquatic organisms. The suction feeding strategies that worked effectively underwater were useless in air, requiring the development of entirely new approaches to prey capture and manipulation. Early tetrapods were developing increasingly sophisticated tongue and jaw coordination that allowed them to capture small arthropods with precision and efficiency. Some species were evolving sticky tongues that could be rapidly projected to capture insects at a distance. Others were developing powerful jaw muscles and modified tooth arrangements that could effectively process the chitinous exoskeletons of terrestrial arthropods. These feeding innovations were enabling early amphibians to exploit prey resources that no vertebrate had ever accessed before. The terrestrial arthropod communities that had evolved without significant vertebrate predation pressure were suddenly facing predators equipped with capabilities they had never encountered. This predation pressure was beginning to drive evolutionary responses in terrestrial arthropod communities, creating the first truly interactive terrestrial predator-prey relationships in vertebrate evolutionary history. The success of early tetrapods in exploiting terrestrial resources was enabling them to achieve body sizes and population densities that would have been impossible for purely aquatic vertebrates in the declining Devonian marine environments. Access to abundant terrestrial food sources allowed some amphibian lineages to grow larger than any of their aquatic ancestors, while others achieved population densities that could support increasingly complex social behaviors and territorial systems. These ecological successes were setting the stage for even more dramatic evolutionary developments. The physiological and behavioral innovations that early tetrapods were developing to cope with terrestrial challenges were creating the foundation for future evolutionary breakthroughs that would eventually free vertebrates entirely from dependence on aquatic environments. Temperature regulation was becoming increasingly sophisticated as amphibians spent more time in terrestrial environments, where thermal conditions were far more variable than in aquatic habitats. Some species were developing behavioral thermoregulation strategies, using basking and shade-seeking behaviors to maintain optimal body temperatures throughout daily activity cycles. Water balance regulation was also becoming more refined. Terrestrial environments posed constant dehydration challenges that purely aquatic animals never faced. Early amphibians were developing increasingly efficient kidney function and behavioral strategies for water conservation that would prove crucial for future terrestrial success. Respiratory systems were undergoing continued refinement as well. The primitive lungs that had initially evolved as supplements to gill breathing were becoming increasingly efficient at extracting oxygen from atmospheric air. Some species were developing more complex lung structures with increased surface area for gas exchange, while others were experimenting with accessory breathing systems that could supplement pulmonary respiration. These physiological innovations were creating the potential for even greater independence from aquatic environments. While reproduction still required return to water for egg-laying and larval development, adult amphibians were becoming capable of spending extended periods in purely terrestrial habitats without physiological stress. The behavioral implications of these capabilities were profound. Early amphibians were developing increasingly complex territorial and social systems that reflected their growing mastery of terrestrial environments. Some species were establishing permanent territories that encompassed optimal combinations of feeding areas, shelter sites, and access to water resources. Others were developing seasonal migration patterns that allowed them to exploit different resources as environmental conditions changed throughout the year. These migrations weren't simple movements between nearby habitats. Some species were traveling considerable distances between seasonal feeding areas and breeding sites, demonstrating navigation capabilities that rivaled those of much later vertebrates. Parental care behaviors were also becoming more sophisticated. While most reproduction still involved aquatic egg-laying, followed by larval development in water, some species were beginning to show increased parental investment in protecting eggs and young. This increased parental care was enabling higher survival rates and was beginning to drive the evolution of more complex reproductive strategies. The social implications of terrestrial living were also driving innovations in communication systems. Visual displays were becoming increasingly important as amphibians developed more sophisticated ways of signaling territorial ownership, reproductive readiness, and threat responses. Some species were evolving elaborate coloration patterns that could be modified for different social contexts. Acoustic communication was also expanding rapidly. The ability to produce and detect airborne sounds opened up entirely new possibilities for long-distance communication that had never been available to purely aquatic vertebrates. Early amphibians were developing increasingly complex vocalizations that could convey detailed information about individual identity, territorial boundaries, and reproductive status. These communication innovations were enabling the formation of more complex social groups and territorial systems than had ever been possible for aquatic vertebrates. Some amphibian communities were developing hierarchical social structures with established dominance relationships and cooperative behaviors that increased survival and reproductive success for all participants. The ecological success of early tetrapods was also beginning to have broader impacts on terrestrial ecosystem structure and function. As the first major vertebrate predators in terrestrial environments, amphibians were beginning to exert top-down control on arthropod communities in ways that were reshaping entire food webs. This predation pressure was driving evolutionary responses in prey species that were creating increasingly complex ecological relationships. Some arthropods were developing better escape responses and defensive behaviors. Others were evolving chemical defenses or warning coloration that could deter amphibian predators. Still others were modifying their activity patterns to avoid times and places where predation risk was highest. These predator-prey interactions were creating the first truly complex terrestrial ecosystems with multiple trophic levels and sophisticated ecological relationships. The relatively simple plant arthropod communities that had characterized early terrestrial environments were being transformed into dynamic ecosystems with complex energy flows and sophisticated species interactions. The nutrient cycling implications of vertebrate terrestrialization were also becoming apparent. Amphibians that fed in terrestrial environments but returned to aquatic habitats for reproduction were creating novel pathways for nutrient transport between terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. This cross-ecosystem nutrient transport was beginning to influence the productivity and species composition of both terrestrial and aquatic communities. These ecological impacts were creating positive feedback loops that further enhanced the success of tetrapod terrestrialization. As amphibians modified terrestrial ecosystems through their predation and nutrient transport activities, they were creating conditions that were even more favorable for vertebrate terrestrial living. The stage was being set for the next major phase of vertebrate terrestrial evolution. The early amphibians had successfully established vertebrates as permanent residents of terrestrial ecosystems. They had developed the basic physiological and behavioral toolkit needed for terrestrial success. Most importantly, they had demonstrated that terrestrial environments could support complex vertebrate communities with sophisticated ecological relationships. But even greater innovations were on the horizon. Some amphibian lineages were beginning to experiment with modifications to their reproductive systems that would eventually eliminate their dependence on aquatic environments entirely. The development of more terrestrial approaches to reproduction would represent the next major breakthrough in vertebrate terrestrial evolution. The amniotic egg was still in the future, but the physiological and behavioral foundations for its evolution were being established by the terrestrial innovations of late Devonian amphibians. The creatures that had learned to bridge aquatic and terrestrial worlds were creating the conditions that would eventually enable their descendants to colonize terrestrial environments completely. The environmental crisis that had ended the age of marine dominance was simultaneously launching the age of terrestrial vertebrates. The fish had not only grown legs and learned to walk on land, they had established the biological and ecological foundations for all future vertebrate terrestrial success. Every terrestrial vertebrate that would ever live would owe its existence to the pioneering experiments conducted by these late Devonian amphibians. The anatomical innovations they developed would become the template for all future terrestrial vertebrate body plans. The physiological adaptations they evolved would provide the foundation for all terrestrial vertebrate life support systems. The ecological strategies they pioneered would establish the behavioral patterns that would characterize terrestrial vertebrate success for hundreds of millions of years. The Devonian Transformation had achieved its ultimate goal. Vertebrates had successfully colonized terrestrial environments and established themselves as permanent residents of land ecosystems. The age of fishes was ending, but the age of terrestrial vertebrates was just beginning. The evolutionary explosion that would follow in the Carboniferous and beyond would build directly on the foundations established by these remarkable pioneers who first dared to leave the water behind and explore the vast possibilities of life on solid ground. The legacy of their achievements surrounds us today in every terrestrial vertebrate community on Earth. From tropical rainforests to Arctic tundra, from desert ecosystems to mountain meadows, the basic ecological principles established by Devonian tetrapods continue to govern how vertebrates interact with terrestrial environments. The anatomical innovations they developed continue to function in every vertebrate that walks, runs, climbs, or flies. Most remarkably, the physiological and behavioral flexibility that enabled their success during the environmental upheavals of the late Devonian continues to characterize vertebrate responses to environmental change today. The adaptability that allowed them to survive the collapse of Devonian marine ecosystems and establish new ways of living in terrestrial environments remains the key to vertebrate success in our rapidly changing modern world. The story of when fish grew legs is ultimately a story about life's remarkable capacity for innovation and adaptation in the face of environmental challenges. It reminds us that even the most fundamental changes in how organisms live and interact with their environments can arise from the gradual accumulation of small evolutionary innovations over vast spans of time. As we face our own era of rapid environmental change, the lessons learned from studying the Devonian Transformation become increasingly relevant. The success of early tetrapods demonstrates that flexibility, adaptability, and willingness to explore new ways of living can enable organisms to not just survive environmental crises, but to thrive in the new worlds that emerge from environmental transformation. The fish grew legs, conquered land, and changed the history of life on Earth forever. Their legacy lives on in every step taken by every terrestrial vertebrate, including ourselves. We are the inheritors of their revolution, the beneficiaries of their innovations, and the continuation of their extraordinary evolutionary journey from sea to land. The transformation we've been following reaches its ultimate expression not in any single moment of triumph, but in the quiet revolution that was reshaping the very fabric of life on Earth. By the closing years of the Devonian period, something unprecedented was unfolding across the continents. For the first time in our planet's 4 billion-year history, vertebrates were establishing permanent communities on solid ground. These weren't temporary visitors making brief excursions from aquatic safety zones. These were residents, creatures that had committed their evolutionary futures to mastering the challenges and opportunities of terrestrial existence. The early amphibians had crossed a threshold that would prove irreversible, establishing patterns of land life that would persist through every subsequent chapter of vertebrate evolution. The ecological relationships they were pioneering would have seemed alien to any observer from earlier geological periods. Vertebrate predators were now actively hunting through terrestrial vegetation, pursuing arthropod prey across solid surfaces, using sensory capabilities and locomotory strategies that had never existed before. These weren't awkward experiments in terrestrial living. They were sophisticated predatory behaviors that demonstrated complete mastery of three-dimensional terrestrial environments. The success of these hunting strategies was enabling amphibian communities to achieve population densities and ecological impacts that rivaled those of established marine ecosystems. Some terrestrial habitats were supporting multiple species of amphibian predators, each occupying distinct ecological niches and employing different approaches to exploiting the abundant arthropod communities that had colonized land environments. This predator diversity was creating the first truly complex terrestrial food webs, with energy flowing through multiple trophic levels and sophisticated species interactions governing community structure and dynamics. The relatively simple plant herbivore systems that had characterized early terrestrial ecosystems were being transformed into dynamic communities with intricate ecological relationships and complex feedback mechanisms. The amphibians weren't just occupying these terrestrial ecosystems, they were actively shaping them through their predation activities, nutrient transport behaviors, and physical modification of habitats. Some species were creating networks of trails and shelter sites that influenced vegetation patterns and soil development. Others were establishing territorial systems that affected the spatial distribution of both prey species and competing predators. These ecosystem engineering activities were creating positive feedback loops that enhanced the suitability of terrestrial environments for vertebrate occupation. As amphibians modified terrestrial habitats through their activities, they were inadvertently creating conditions that supported even greater vertebrate diversity and ecological complexity. The physiological innovations that had enabled this terrestrial success were continuing to evolve and improve. Temperature regulation capabilities were becoming more sophisticated, allowing amphibians to remain active across broader ranges of thermal conditions. Water balance mechanisms were becoming more efficient, enabling extended periods of terrestrial activity without physiological stress. Respiratory systems were undergoing continued refinement as well. The lungs that had initially evolved as emergency backup systems for gill breathing were becoming the primary organs for gas exchange in many species. Some lineages were developing increasingly complex lung structures with enhanced surface areas and improved ventilation mechanisms that rivaled the efficiency of much later terrestrial vertebrates. These physiological advances were enabling behavioral innovations that pushed the boundaries of amphibian terrestrial capability even further. Some species were developing daily activity patterns that maximized their exploitation of terrestrial resources while minimizing physiological stress. Others were establishing seasonal migration routes that allowed them to track optimal environmental conditions across vast geographical areas. The reproductive strategies of late Devonian amphibians were also becoming more sophisticated, though they remained tied to aquatic environments for egg-laying and larval development. Some species were developing elaborate courtship behaviors and territorial displays that increased their reproductive success in competitive mating environments. Parental care behaviors were becoming more complex as well. While most amphibians still relied on external fertilization and aquatic larval development, some species were beginning to show increased investment in protecting eggs and young. This enhanced parental care was improving survival rates and creating opportunities for more sophisticated reproductive strategies. But perhaps the most significant development was occurring among lineages that were beginning to experiment with modifications to their reproductive biology that would eventually reduce their dependence on aquatic environments. Some species were developing eggs with enhanced protective membranes that could survive in more terrestrial conditions. Others were exploring direct development strategies that reduced the duration of vulnerable aquatic larval stages. These reproductive innovations were still primitive compared to what would eventually evolve, but they represented the first tentative steps toward completely terrestrial reproduction. The genetic and developmental mechanisms that would eventually give rise to the amniotic egg were beginning to emerge through the gradual modification of existing reproductive systems. And so we reach the end of one of the most extraordinary chapters in the history of life on Earth. The Devonian Transformation stands as testament to evolution's remarkable creativity and the profound interconnectedness that binds all vertebrate life together across the vast expanse of geological time. What began as subtle modifications to fish fins in ancient seas had culminated in something revolutionary. Vertebrates had not simply visited the land, they had conquered it, establishing themselves as permanent residents of terrestrial ecosystems, and laying the foundation for every land-dwelling vertebrate that would ever live. The anatomical innovations pioneered by Tiktaalik, Acanthostega, and their contemporaries continue to function in every step you take, every breath you draw, every movement you make through the world. The bone patterns they established became the template for all vertebrate limbs. The respiratory systems they developed became the foundation for all terrestrial breathing. The ecological strategies they pioneered established behavioral patterns that persist in modern vertebrates, from migrating birds to spawning salmon. Perhaps, most remarkably, the environmental resilience that allowed these ancient pioneers to survive the late Devonian extinctions and thrive during periods of dramatic change remains the key to vertebrate success in our rapidly changing modern world. Their story reminds us that life's greatest innovations often emerge not during times of stability, but during moments of crisis when organisms must find entirely new ways to survive and flourish. The fish grew legs, learned to breathe air, and stepped onto solid ground for the first time in Earth's history. In doing so, they changed the trajectory of life itself, setting in motion an evolutionary adventure that continues today in every terrestrial creature that calls our planet home. This transformation belongs to all of us. We are the living legacy of that ancient revolution, carrying within our bodies the innovations that first allowed vertebrates to leave the sea behind and explore the infinite possibilities of life on land. Every time we walk across solid ground, we continue the journey that began in the warm, shallow waters of the Devonian period over 300 million years ago. The age of fishes had ended, but the age of terrestrial vertebrates had begun. And what an age it would prove to be.